Chapter 1. In the year 2035, a world-shaking explosion took place in the sky above one of Xian country's biggest cities, Rushing City. Not only did the city and the surrounding terrain undergo a huge change due to the explosion, but the sudden appearance of the otherworld also caused a part of the otherworld to merge with the modern world. The series of changes that took place in the city caused people to call this terrifying city Magic City. It attracted the attention of almost every country in the world. At this moment, 16 years had passed since the explosion. In a courtyard in Demonic City, Fang Xingjian, who had just turned 16 years old, was standing on a green stone slab, practicing his basic sword techniques one by one. This set of basic sword technique was something he had learned from an ordinary dojo. Although it was simple, it contained all the basic movements of sword techniques. It could be said that it was a compulsory path for all sword practitioners in Magic City. An hour later, under the rays of the winter sun, streams of white perspiration broke out from Fang Xingjian's body. Sufficient exercise had allowed his muscles to continuously release heat, and every fiber in his body had received sufficient training. After practicing the last move, Fang Xingjian slowly put away his sword and focused his attention on the stats window in his mind. Name: Fang Xingjian. Age: 16. Occupation: Warrior Squire. Level: 9 Strength, 9 Agility, 9 Reaction, 6 Endurance, 6 Flexibility, 6 Level 3 Basic Sword Technique, 15325/32500. Level 2 Single-Handed Sword Technique, 23455/42200. Level 2 Cross/11325/23900. Ever since Magic City and the Otherworld merged, all matter within Magic City seemed to have entered the Otherworld. As long as it entered Magic City, it would have a digital reaction, including humans themselves. The entire world within Magic City had undergone a fundamental change. The original laws of physics in the universe seemed to have lost their effectiveness at this moment. Bodies that could be digitized were like everyone had entered the world of online games. They could even level up and add points. For example, when Fang Xingjian was practicing the basic sword technique, he was increasing his proficiency in basic sword technique and single-handed sword technique. With each practice, his proficiency would increase. When his proficiency met the requirements, his skills would level up. Those with good talent would gain more proficiency with each practice, and they would need less proficiency to level up. If their talent was good enough, the upper limit of their skills could go beyond level 10 and reach level 12, 13, or even 15. However, Fang Xingjian was well aware of his own aptitude. Based on the rate at which his proficiency increased and the requirements for leveling up, his aptitude was only average. The 3 sword techniques that he had mastered would probably only be able to reach level 10. He carefully put away the training sword in his hand. Every training tool he had was bought after he saved every cent, so he treasured a lot. After keeping the long sword, Fang Xingjian picked up a huge steel sword that weighed over 100 kilograms. This huge sword was formed from a single piece and did not have a blade. It was a training tool that had sacrificed everything else for the sake of its weight. After practicing half of the basic sword technique, Fang Xingjian picked up a steel sword that weighed over 100 kilograms. This sword was formed in one piece and didn't have a blade. It was a training tool that had sacrificed everything else for the sake of weight. After practicing half of the basic sword technique, he couldn't help but slam the sword into the ground. With a loud bang, cracks appeared on the ground. Fang Xingjian panted heavily. He felt that his arms were extremely sore, and he couldn't lift them anymore. This won't do. I'm still too far away from the realm of wielding something heavy as though it were light. To be able to wield a sword that weighed 100 kilograms like it was an ordinary sword, such a physique was known as wielding something heavy as though it were light. It was said that this was a standard that came from another world. One could only do it if their strength, agility, endurance, and flexibility attributes were all at least 10 points. Strength, agility, reaction, endurance, and flexibility were known as the 5 main attributes. Strength represented the ability to resist resistance when moving. Agility represented the speed at which muscles could move and contract. Reaction represented the efficiency at which the nerves and brain could react when encountering an event. The combination of reaction and agility represented the speed at which a person could move in battle. Endurance represented the endurance of muscles and blood vessels. The higher the value, the more times one could move and perform skills. Flexibility represented the ease at which a person could perform various actions. The more flexible one was, the more stable one's strength and speed would be. The closer one was to the maximum they could perform, the stronger one's explosive power would be, and the lower the chances of getting injured would be. The effect of the 5 main attributes was not proportional. A strength of 10 points was a few times stronger than a strength of 5 points, but it wasn't 2 times stronger. To be able to wield something heavy as though it were light meant that one's strength, agility, endurance, and flexibility were all at least 10 points. They would be as fast as a galloping horse and as strong as a water buffalo. Every punch and kick would be enough to kill an ordinary person. Right now, Fang Xingjian wasn't swinging the steel sword to test his stamina. Instead, he was swinging it to train his attributes in a balanced manner. Keeping the steel sword, Fang Xingjian ended his morning training and started to scrub his body, changing into a blue shirt and a black suit. The blue shirt had been washed until it had turned white, and the suit was too small to fit him. It was obvious that Fang Xingjian's current financial situation wasn't good. However, he still wore the suit and walked out of the small courtyard. What entered his eyes were layers upon layers of ancient-looking Chinese courtyards. Along the way, he could see strong young men in suits patrolling the area. There were also women in white uniforms watering the plants, sweeping the floor, and doing all sorts of chores. When they saw Fang Xingjian passing by, everyone would lower their heads and greet him as young Master Xingjian. It was like a grand family from ancient times, a rich and powerful family. In fact, as one of the 5 great families in Demonic City, the Fang family was indeed a place like an ancient feudal family. In history, the Fang family was a feudal family that had a legacy of over 200 years. In the previous dynasty, when they were at their most prosperous, they had control over 10,000 mu of fertile farmland, over 100 banks, and countless servants and beautiful concubines. However, 100 years ago, the previous dynasty had reached its end, and the new dynasty had been established. The entire world had gone through a great change, and the Fang family had been afraid that the new country might seek revenge on the previous dynasty's wealthy families. Thus, they had gone into hiding overseas and started to expand their family. Until 20 years ago, when the country's situation had become clear and the international situation had changed, the Fang family had gradually shifted their businesses back to the country. For years after they had returned to the country, which was 16 years ago now, the other world had descended. Everything outside of Demonic City was the same as before, but within Demonic City, it had become a digitized world, just like the other world. Countless people had taken the opportunity to rise up, venturing into the other world for an adventure and then returning. Relying on their powerful individual abilities, they had accomplished a world-shaking feat. The clans of the 5 strongest people were known as the 5 great families, and the Fang family was one of them. Unfortunately, 7 years ago, the head of the Fang family had died in battle in the other world, and the family's foundation had been handed over to his wife to look after. Since then, the Fang family's reputation had gradually declined, and now they had become the weakest of the 5 great families. After walking through the long corridor, Fang Xingjian entered the dining room and saw a middle-aged woman who still retained her charm sitting at the head of the table. The woman's black hair was tied up high, and it was combed meticulously. She was wearing a small red suit with a straight collar, and the high heels on her feet were polished to a shine. With one look, one could tell that she was an extremely strict person. The corners of her eyes were slightly raised, and a pair of sword-like eyebrows were raised high. She did not speak, but there was a sense of ruthlessness in her. With one look, one would think that she was an extremely difficult person to talk to. Only by observing very carefully would one be able to see a hint of deep exhaustion in the wrinkles on her forehead. The old mistress had been looking at the documents in her hands from beginning to end. It was only when Fang Xingjian entered the dining room that she raised her head to look at her eldest grandson and said calmly, "Sit." This woman was the current head of the Fang family, Fang Xingjian's grandmother, the Fang family's old mistress, Li Shuanghua. Fang Xingjian carefully sat on the chair, and he sat upright and still. His butt only took up 1/3 of the space. Beside him was a couple in their 30s. They were the younger brother and sister-in-law of Fang Xingjian's mother, and they were Fang Xingjian's second uncle and second aunt. Fang Xingjian smiled and nodded at his second uncle. Second uncle smiled and wanted to say something, but he was held back by his second aunt. He could only give Fang Xingjian a helpless look. Second aunt's family had been rising fiercely in recent years, and their strength had increased greatly. This caused second aunt's voice to be louder and louder in the family. Second uncle, who had always been strict with his wife, now went along with second aunt. In the past, Fang Xingjian was not well liked in the family. Only second uncle would chat with him and ask if he was hot or cold. But now, second aunt was very strict with him, and he almost didn't talk to Fang Xingjian anymore. However, the two of them had not been able to conceive a child since they got married. This was also the reason why the old mistress didn't like second aunt. If it wasn't for second aunt's family's strength increasing greatly in the past few years, the old mistress would have long divorced second uncle and second aunt. In the dining room, other than the old mistress, the three people sat upright, and no one dared to speak. With the old mistress's tyrannical strength and the style of a feudal matriarch, no one in the Fang family dared to go against her. She was the only one who had the final say. After a quarter of an hour, the old mistress frowned, and the three people present instantly became nervous. She put away the documents, looked up, and said to the maid beside her, "Ah Xing, go see what's taking third young master and the others. Tell them to come in 5 minutes." Chapter 2. Just as the old granny gave the order, a commotion rang out, and Fang Xingjian's third uncle, Fang Yueming, walked in with a smile. "Mother, there's no need to shout. Look, aren't I here now? Sai, I was so busy last night. Let's see if there's anything to eat." Second aunt laughed coldly in her heart. What else can he be busy with? I think he must have stayed at the casino the entire night and didn't return home. The old granny grabbed her chopsticks and slapped away Fang Xingjian's hand, which was reaching toward the dining table. "How many times have I told you that we can only start eating when everyone is here? Don't you have any manners?" "Mother, I'm hungry," third uncle said, feeling wronged. "You?" Looking at her youngest son whom she doted on the most. Although the old granny's heart softened, she still said sternly, "Bear with it a little longer. We'll be eating soon." As she spoke, third aunt had already walked in with a well-built 4-year-old child in her arms. When the old granny saw this grandson of hers, the icy expression on her face melted in an instant, revealing a rare, gentle smile. In this family, third uncle's family was the one the old granny doted on the most. Third aunt smiled as well. When she saw third uncle, who looked drowsy and had dark circles under his eyes, she gave him a fierce kick. Fang Xingjian knew that third aunt was also a ruthless character. Not only did she come from military faction, but she was also shrewd and harsh. She was also very good at getting on people's good graces. Not only third uncle, but even the old granny liked her very much. Moreover, after giving birth to a grandson 4 years ago, third uncle's family was now even more doted on by the old granny. When second aunt saw this scene, she became even more displeased. She glared at second uncle fiercely, and the latter could only smile foolishly. The old granny said calmly, "Let's start eating." In an instant, maids walked in like flowing water and started serving bowls and chopsticks, opening the lids of various utensils, and pouring fruit juices and wine. With the old granny's words, the entire dining table came alive. Fang Xingjian carefully ate the food in front of him, while second uncle occasionally placed food on his wife's plate. Third uncle eagerly grabbed a chicken drumstick and started gnawing on it. Third aunt glared at him angrily. Everyone ate in an orderly and quiet manner. No one dared to say a word, because this was the rule set by the old lady. No talking while eating, no talking while sleeping. Unlike Fong Xingjian, who was only at level 9, the old lady had long since reached level 30. She did not have high requirements for food and would only eat a few mouthfuls. Looking at her grandson, whose lips were dripping with grease, she smiled and picked up a tissue to wipe the grease from the corner of her grandson's mouth. Her face was full of kindness, and there was no sign of the frosty look from before. Eat slowly. You have to eat like you're eating. Fong Xingchen, who was 4 years old, had been taught the rules of various great clans from a young age. He was not like a child from an ordinary family. Right now, he looked like a little adult, sitting up straight and picking food for himself. His every action was well-behaved and not biased. If it could be said that the old lady doted on third uncle and third aunt's family the most, disliking second aunt and hating second uncle for being useless, then for some unknown reason, she detested Fong Xingjian, this grandson of hers. Fong Xingjian was aware of this as well. Therefore, from the beginning to the end, he just sat quietly at the side, eating the few bowls of food in front of him. He did not even know how to stand up and pick food for himself. After more than 20 minutes, everyone was almost done eating. The maidservant cleared away the bowls and chopsticks while pushing a big bowl of soup over. The moment they saw the soup, second uncle and second aunt, as well as third uncle and third aunt, all revealed looks of anticipation. This soup was a super ferocious beast of level 25 and above, the Abyss 9-headed bird, which had been captured by the military in the other world. It was then transported to Demonic City, where it was brewed using the heart of the 9-headed bird as the main ingredient, along with 81 types of expensive medicinal herbs. The 9-headed bird's soup was brewed into the 9-blood spirit changing soup. After drinking this soup, it was not as simple as filling one's stomach. It could also cleanse one's muscles and bones, replenish one's vital energy and blood, cleanse one's marrows and tendons, and improve one's physique. It could greatly increase the effects of ordinary people's cultivation. Even with the Fong clan's financial resources, they could only afford to drink a small bowl every day during lunch. Immediately, the maidservant served the soup to everyone, and everyone eagerly drank it. Xingchen, Granny will give you this bowl too. The old lady looked at her grandson, gulping down the soup in big mouthfuls, seeming to be happier than if she was drinking it herself. The 4-year-old Fong Xingchen said politely, "1 bowl is enough for me. Granny, you have to attend to many affairs every day and are the pillar of the Fong clan. This bowl of 9-blood spirit changing soup should be left to you." The old lady smiled and said, "It's fine. This soup is not essential to me since a long time ago. You're still growing, so drink it yourself." "Thank you, Granny, for your reward." Fong Xingchen raised a small hand and respectfully received the bowl of soup. On the other side, Fong Xingjian was naturally the last to be served the soup. Looking at the mysterious soup that resembled a tiger's soul in the bowl, his throat could not help but tremble. Drinking this bowl of soup was a great supplement to his vital energy, blood, muscles, and muscles. This was also one of the benefits of being born in a large clan. He could not wait to finish the entire bowl of 9-blood spirit changing soup. He felt a warm and harmonious feeling throughout his body, as if there was a warm current flowing around his body, continuously cleansing and tempering his physical body. Fong Xingjian sniffed the bowl of soup, as if he had not had enough, and looked at Fong Xingchen with an envious expression. However, he knew that he could not be envious of the old lady's love for Fong Xingchen. After eating and drinking, the servants kept the cutlery away and started to serve tea and snacks. Everyone knew that this was the time when the old lady would discuss the matters of the clan and test them on their homework. Taking a sip of tea, the old lady said, "Recently, there hasn't been any problems with the food and clothing at home, right?" Second aunt quickly stood up. She had always been in charge of the food, clothing, and money at home. She said, "It's basically enough. Mother, do you want to take a look at the accounts?" As long as it's enough. I won't be taking a look at the accounts." The old lady glanced at her expression and asked, "Is there anything else?" Second aunt said proudly, "Mother, second uncle, has been working hard on his cultivation recently, and has finally reached level 19. He's already preparing to go through the second transition. Based on mankind's current research, a person could level up from level 1 to 30. However, from level 9 to 10, from level 19 to 20, and from level 29 to 30, there would be a checkpoint for each of them. One would only be able to continue to level up after going through a job transition. Naturally, the other world had a method of job transitions that had been passed down since ancient times. Although there was no such method on Earth, with the research of various country scientists and the help of the other world's forces, they had invented a method of extracting the essence of ferocious beasts and drawing magic prints on the human body to undergo job transitions. From the first job transition to the second job transition, all the way to the divine level at level 29 and the third job transition at level 30, not only would one gain extraordinary power, they would also gain job growth. For example, before the first job transition, for every level below level 9, ordinary people would only gain an increase of 1 free attribute point. However, after the first job transition, from level 9 to level 19, with every level up, even the worst job would gain an increase of 1 point in strength and 1 point in agility, as well as 1 free attribute point. The stronger the job transition, the more extraordinary power one would gain, and the higher the job growth would be. It would be very difficult to win against a person with a difference of 1 level, and with a difference of 2 levels, the chances of winning would be 0. With a difference of 3 levels, it would be a crushing victory. Of course, there were also exceptions. For example, if one had outstanding talent, even if their level was not as high as the other party, they would be able to challenge those of a higher level after learning more powerful techniques and obtaining more powerful specialties. Attributes, techniques, specialties. These were the 3 main factors that determined a person's battle prowess. Hearing second aunt's words and seeing her smug expression, third aunt laughed coldly in her heart and interrupted, "Yo, second brother is going to go through the second job transition so soon? Don't tell me that you get experience from killing monsters?" Leveling up required experience, and there were 3 ways to gain experience. 1. Kill ferocious beasts or humans. 2. Read or learn. 3. Train one's skills or physical body. Killing monsters was very difficult for others, but for a great clan like the Fawn clan, they could totally buy a bunch of dying ferocious beasts to kill and quickly level up. However, such levels were usually considered to be the weakest amongst those of the same level. It was because they did not have high attributes, many techniques, and specialties like those who had relied on learning, training, and training to level up. This was also something that Fawn Clan's old granny did not like. Hearing third aunt's words, second aunt's brows furrowed as anger rose in her heart. However, seeing old granny's slight frown, she immediately explained, "That's not true. Ueha, second uncle, has been working very hard in his training recently. I got my elder brother to specially guide him on the path of saber arts, and he has improved very quickly. That's why he's reached level 19. Hearing that, old granny nodded. "I've heard of a mortal slaying saber, second aunt's elder brother, name for a long time. Second brother, this is a rare opportunity. You must learn from him." "I understand." Seeing how obedient Fong Xingjian was, old granny said in satisfaction, "You're my son, and also the Fong clan's second master. Since you're going to go through the second job transition, the clan will naturally help you. What are your plans?" Second uncle said carefully, "I'm planning to choose between the Blood Abyss Sovereign and the Calamity Envoy. Both are not bad. However, both of them will cost quite a lot of money, right?" Old granny said, "I'll get someone to transfer 50 million to you later. You can choose whichever magic prince you want for the job transition." Hearing this, second aunt and second uncle's faces were filled with surprise, and they thanked her profusely. Third uncle looked indifferent, but third aunt's face was a little gloomy, and she looked very unhappy. Second aunt glanced at third aunt complacently and suddenly asked, "Oh, right. Sister, I see that third brother has been going out early and coming back late recently. He must have been working very hard in his training. Furthermore, I've personally invited 2 masters to guide him. He must have improved very quickly, and he should be going through the second job transition soon. Third, Aunt naturally knew what kind of person her husband was. Even though her mother-in-law had invited military instructors to guide him, this guy was still a good-for-nothing. She would already be thanking the heavens if he did not go to the gambling dens every night, let alone training. Even though he was almost 30 years old, he was only at level 14. Hearing what Fong Xingjian said, Third Aunt could only smile with an ugly expression. Not yet. How could he be so fast? Yueming, third uncle, is planning to consolidate his skills. Following that, old Granny talked about some other things. She tested second uncle and third uncle's homework, and then commented on them. Naturally, second aunt felt that she had the upper hand, and she looked very pleased. Third aunt was exasperated, hating her husband for being useless. Chapter 3. In the end, the old granny clapped her hands. Seeing that everyone had turned to look at her, she had a smug smile on her face. Those who were familiar with the old granny knew that she had something to announce. The old granny smiled and said, Xingqian's test report is out. There were two main types of occupations that humans could cultivate. One was the most common type that everyone could cultivate, the warrior type. The other was the type that only those with telekinesis talent could cultivate, the 1 in 10,000 mages. If one had to describe the difference between mages and warriors, it was basically the difference between a second transition warrior and a first transition warrior, or between a third transition warrior and a second transition warrior. They were killing machines that were born to be superior to all other living creatures. Fong Xingjian had naturally taken the test when he was young, but it was a pity that he did not have the talent to become a mage. Hearing that Fong Xingqian's test report was out, and looking at the old granny's expression, everyone's faces were filled with doubt. The mage qualification test would conduct an in-depth test on the examinee's mental state, physical state, consciousness, telekinesis talent, and various other aspects. The results of the test would naturally determine whether the examinee had the potential to become a mage. Facing everyone's gaze, the old granny smiled at Fong Xingqian and said, It seems that our Fong clan is going to have a mage. The test report says that Xingqian has the potential to become a red-robe mage. How? How is that possible? Seeing this scene, second aunt's expression turned extremely grim. She knew that from this moment onwards, she could no longer compete with third aunt. Third aunt cheered wildly. Ha, red robe. It's the talent of a red-robe mage. My son is a red-robe mage. Mage? Third uncle said with a dumbfounded expression. My son has the talent to become a mage? My son is going to become a mage. I'm going to be a mage's father. Ha 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 ha. Looking at Fong Xingqian, who was dumbfounded and at a loss, the old granny smiled and said, Xingqian, Granny has already registered you with the Mage Association. You must study hard in magic in the future. The entire scene was in chaos. All sorts of envious, jealous, and excited gazes were directed at Fong Xingqian, making him the absolute main character at this moment. Fong Xingjian's face also revealed a look of longing, but it eventually turned into sadness as he slowly retreated out of the hall. Young master has the talent to become a mage. Have you heard? The young master has been tested to have the talent to become a wizard. Is this for real? It's finally our Fong clan's turn to stand up for the 5 great clans. Walking along the long corridor, Fong Xingjian could hear the conversations of the servants. In the blink of an eye, the news that Fong Xingjian had the talent to become a mage had spread throughout the entire residence. There were also people who looked at Fong Xingjian with gloating expressions. Fong Xingjian had always been favored by the old madam, and now that he had the talent to become a mage, his life became even more difficult for Fong Xingjian, who was already disliked by the old madam. Fong Xingjian's feelings were extremely complicated. He was happy that his brother had the talent to become a wizard, and he was happy that the Fong clan was about to prosper. However, there was also a mixture of bitterness, jealousy, and envy in his heart. Why am I not the one with the talent? If I'm the one with the talent, then Grandma will like me too, right? Just as Fong Xingjian was in a daze, he unknowingly walked into a small courtyard in a bamboo forest. He could no longer see the servants around him. and it was as if he had entered another world. Following that, he heard a sigh. 10 years, life and death. 2 years. As the sigh entered his ears, Feng Xingjian only felt an extreme loneliness and coldness rising from his heart. It was as if his blood was about to freeze, and his life had become bleak. However, he was, after all, at level 9, and was someone who could go through the first transition at any time. His physical attributes were not to be underestimated, and he immediately reacted. Lifting his head, he saw a black-robed man standing over 10 meters away with his back facing him. The black-robed man looked extremely blurry, and where he stood, his entire body was enveloped in a dense black light, as if he was an emissary from the netherworld. "Who are you? How dare you barge into the Feng residence?" Feng Xingjian immediately understood that the other party was definitely not someone a mere warrior like him, who had not even gone through the first transition, could deal with. He let out a loud bellow, wanting to alert everyone in the residence. However, just as he finished saying this, the black-robed man turned around and pointed a finger at him. The next moment, purple flames gushed forth, and Feng Xingjian felt as if his entire body was being burned by the blazing purple flames. He subconsciously cried out in agony. "Ah, young master, young master." Feng Xingjian opened his eyes and saw a servant standing before him, calling out to him. Before him was still the bamboo forest and the courtyard, but there was no black-robed man or purple flames. It was as if everything that had happened earlier had been an illusion. He looked at the servant before him and asked, "Did you see the black-robed man? Purple flames? What black-robed man and purple flames?" "Young master, you've been standing here all this while." The servant paused for a moment, looked at him in astonishment, and said, "The old ancestor asked me to call you to the ancestral hall." "Illusion?" Feng Xingjian shook his head. He still could not understand what had happened earlier, and could only put it aside for now. He said, "Grandmother is asking me to go to the ancestral hall? I understand, I'll go right now." He walked all the way to the ancestral hall, but did not realize that, unbeknownst to him, there was now a small purple flame tattoo on the back of his neck. Feng Xingjian lowered his head and walked into the ancestral hall with a respectful expression. The old granny was already standing in the middle of the hall, looking at the memorial tablets before her. When the rich became famous, they would always create things like genealogies and ancestral halls. The Feng clan was no exception. In this ancestral hall, there were memorial tablets for the past few generations of the Feng clan. At the side, there was a cinerary hall where the ashes of the ancestors were placed. Feng Xingjian's mother was among them. Looking at the name of Yueru, Feng Xingjian's mother, on the memorial tablet, the old granny Li Shuanghua revealed a complicated expression. Hearing Feng Xingjian's footsteps, she did not turn back. She only said, "You're going to go through the first transition soon, right?" "Yes, I've been at level 9 for more than a month." The old granny nodded and said, "Where do you plan to go next?" Feng Xingjian said honestly, "I plan to apply for the top Blue Mountain Academy." The Blue Mountain Academy was a warrior school set up by the military, specializing in nurturing outstanding young warriors. The old granny suddenly said, "You haven't prepared the magic prints for the first transition, have you? I'll get someone to transfer 2 million to you later. You can purchase ferocious beasts from the market, and you'll be able to complete your job transition faster." Hearing the old granny's words, Feng Xingjian was so surprised that he could not believe it. The job transition system in Demonic City was built on magic prints, and magic prints required the essence of ferocious beasts from another world. Feng Xingjian had been troubled over how to get his hands on ferocious beasts. He had not expected that his grandmother, who had been ignoring him all this while, would actually help him. However, before he could recover from his surprise, the old granny had already continued. "There's no need for you to go to the Blue Mountain Academy. I've already helped Xingchen contact the Mage Association. When the time comes, after you've completed your first transition, you can go to the Mage Academy with him." Feng Xingjian asked in a daze, "Mage school?" Before mages have completed their first transition, they are still relatively weak. "Since you're brothers, I want you to be his apostle. You're his elder brother, so you must take good care of him in the Mage Academy. Fong Xingjian did not listen to the rest of the old granny's words. His mind was completely filled with the word apostle. A mage's apostle was a nicer way of putting it. He also had another name, mage's slave. It was a form of evil sorcery performed by mages, binding another life to themselves. The mage's slave would forever be under the command of the caster, and any injuries that the caster suffered could be transferred to the mage's slave. However, the requirements to become a mage's slave were extremely strict. Not only did it have a high requirement for one's physique and intelligence, it also had to be someone who was related by blood. For example, both Fong Xingjian and Fong Xingchen. Fong Xingjian's many years of hard work and training had instead become a stepping stone for Fong Xingchen to become stronger. Fong Xingjian laughed bitterly. "Grandmother, you've never cared about me since I was young. When I was 6, I fainted from fever. When I was about to die, it was second uncle who sent me to the hospital. You didn't even take a look at me. All these years, my monthly allowance has been deducted by second aunt, and I've been dragged by third aunt to run errands every day. I've suffered in silence, but you've never asked about it. Now that Xingchen has talent in sorcery, I'm very happy, but you want me to be his mage's slave? Grandmother, I'll just ask you one thing. Have you really treated me as your grandson? Scoundrel." The old granny slapped Fong Xingjian's face. Looking at his stubborn gaze, she said angrily, "Is this how you talk to your elders? If you treat me as your grandson, I'll naturally treat you as my elder. If you don't treat me as a human, I won't respect you as my elder either." Fong Xingjian looked at the old granny and said with determination, "I must go to the Blue Mountain Academy. Even if Xingchen is my younger brother, I won't give up my life for him." "Huh." The old granny was so angry that she laughed. "Fine. Since when did you have the right to make decisions in this family? Young people don't know when to stop, so it's only natural for the elders to make the decisions. Your life? From the moment you were born, you've been a member of the Fong clan. You've grown up eating the food of the Fong clan. If not for me, you'd have starved to death outside. How would you have any life? I won't go." Fong Xingjian resisted with all his might. "Even if I die, I won't become a mage's slave." "Oomph." The old granny let out a cold snort and struck out with her palm. A strong gust of wind blew, and a violent atmosphere pressed down on Fong Xingjian's body, forcing him to kneel down. "I'm the one who gave you your life. You're a member of the Fong clan when you're alive, and you'll be a ghost of the Fong clan when you die. It's not up to you to have such thoughts. Xingchen is now our clan's hope. You must be his shadow and protect him for life, even if you have to die for him. No one should die for others." Fong Xingjian shouted, "To think that you want me to become a mage's slave. That means that you don't want me to be your grandson. From today onward, I, Fong Xingjian, no longer have you as my grandmother." "Ha ha ha." The old granny was so angry that her face turned pale. The cold gleam emitted from her eyes seemed to be able to freeze and shatter space. She turned to look at the memorial tablet behind her and said furiously, "Fong Yueru, take a good look. This is the bastard son you've given birth to. He doesn't know shame and doesn't want to be a son. He's exactly the same as you were back then. You're not allowed to scold my mother." Fong Xingjian's face flushed red, and the muscles all over his body trembled rapidly, wanting to force himself to stand up. However, the power of a level 30 divine level expert was definitely not something he could handle right now. The old granny let out a cold snort, and with a gentle release of violent air pressure, he was pressed down onto the ground and lost consciousness. The old granny Li Shuanghua let out a few cold laughs and walked out of the ancestral hall. Tens of warriors in black clothes and black armor knelt down. This was the Fong clan's secret first transition job, and only the old granny Li Shuanghua knew the contents of the magic prints. Their attributes would grow to +3 in strength, +2 in agility, and +4 in endurance. They wore alloy armor that weighed over 200 kilograms and were equipped with high-frequency broadswords produced by the military. They were also equipped with the latest electromagnetic rifles. Almost every one of them was a human-shaped tank, and they were one of the Fong clan's most elite forces. Keep an eye on him. Don't let him come out. Yes. Chapter 4. A few hours later, Fang Xingjian slowly regained consciousness and realized that he was still in the ancestral hall. He slowly recalled the conversation he had with Li Shuanghua, and his eyes were filled with bitterness. He was about to leave the ancestral hall when he was stopped by the black crystal armored cavalry. He turned around and realized that the entire ancestral hall had been surrounded by the black crystal armored cavalry. Knowing that it was impossible for him to charge out with his current abilities, he sat down to think of a solution. With grandmother's stubbornness, she'll definitely do more than she says. If I don't think of a way to escape, I'll be Fang Xingqian's slave for the rest of my life. This is definitely not the life I want. But how do I escape? These black crystal armored cavalry have been nurtured by the family since they were young. Although they don't have many skills and almost no specialties, their levels have all been accumulated through killing monsters. In addition to the job progression of the black crystal armored cavalry, their strength, agility, and endurance are all above 30 points. With more than 30 points of strength, agility, and endurance, they could easily knock over an elephant, flip over a tank, and knead metal rods like noodles. It was impossible for the current Fang Xingjian to charge out. What should I do? After thinking for more than an hour, Fang Xingjian still had no clue. Just then, a conversation could be heard from outside. You guys leave. Mother asked me to come and persuade him. But Sir said, You don't trust me? Or do you think that I can't keep an eye on him? I wouldn't dare. The sound of metal armor rubbing against the ground could be heard from outside. It was the sound of the black crystal armored cavalry retreating. Soon, the door opened, and Second Uncle walked in slowly. Fang Xingjian looked at Second Uncle with a pained expression and said, Second Uncle, are you here to persuade me? AI. Second Uncle sighed. Come with me. Puzzled, Fang Xingjian followed Second Uncle out. He realized that the servants in the surroundings had disappeared. The two of them walked further and further, and in the blink of an eye, they arrived at the back door of the Fang clan. Mother wants you to be Xingqian's apostle, and I don't agree either. However, she has already made up her mind, and I can't persuade her. Second Uncle shook his head and said calmly, Go. Go to Miracle World. Earthlings refer to the other worlds, and run as far away as you can. Don't ever come back. Fang Xingjian's eyes reddened as he looked at his second uncle. It was as if he had returned to the romantic and talented man he was before he got married. Uncle, there's 2 million in this anonymous card. Keep it safe. This is your uncle's secret stash of money that I've been living frugally for the past few years. If your second aunt finds out, it'll be over. Second Uncle sighed and said, Sigh, I haven't been able to take good care of you all these years. You don't belong to the Fang family. Go out and find your own path. Don't stay in Shanghai, or Mom will catch you. Fang Xingjian took the card and said in a low voice, Uncle, thank you. Second Uncle didn't say anything. Instead, he stared at Fang Xingjian's face and said, They look alike, they really look alike. What? You and your mother are really alike. Fang Xingjian suddenly became agitated. He looked at Second Uncle and asked, Second Uncle, why does grandmother hate me so much? What did I do wrong? How did my mother die? And who is my father? Why is it that every time I ask, grandmother flies into a rage? In one breath, he asked all these questions that had been troubling him since he was young. Regarding eldest sister, I can't explain it clearly either. If you want to know, you can come back and ask Mother when you become a divine level expert. Suddenly, the entire courtyard was in a commotion. Second Uncle said anxiously, Leave quickly. They're heading this way. I'll lure them away. Fang Xingjian took one last long look at the Fang clan's courtyard, then turned and ran out into the darkness outside the door. One day, I'll be back. Grandmother, I'll prove to you that you're wrong. In the train station, Fang Xingjian looked at the staff at the counter and asked, Is it still not working? The staff raised his head and carefully compared Fang Xingjian's appearance with the photo on his identity document. He then said, I'm sorry, there's a problem with the machine. Please wait a moment. Fang Xingjian threw a puzzled glance at the staff and subconsciously looked around his surroundings. He discovered that there were many tall and strong men walking toward him from all the gates, corridors, and public squares. Damn it. Fang Xingjian dashed out, his agility and strength of 9 points exploding at the same time, making him like a raging bull. He's trying to escape. Capture him. Don't shoot. The men, who had been slowly approaching him earlier, immediately reacted and surrounded Fang Xingjian. After a round of pursuit, Fang Xingjian managed to shake off the men with his superior physical attributes. Leaning against the wall, he panted heavily. The airport has been sealed off. Did they take the official route? He knew that, with the Fang clan's influence, it would be too easy for them to add a search and capture order to all the transportation vehicles. If that's the case, I won't be able to get to Miracle World through the official route. Miracle World was connected to Earth, and the connection point was in Demonic City. However, it was not a specific passageway, a door, or a bridge. Instead, it was a large area that overlapped with each other. This area covered a large area of land and sea. Therefore, one could travel there by car, boat, or even walking. Therefore, the entire area was sealed off by a few large countries. If ordinary people want to go there, they would have to go through the various levels of government approval. Fang Xingjian had already prepared the documents as a way out, but now he was blocked by the Fang clan's orders. Not only that, once he was discovered to be trying to enter the area, the upper echelons would send people to capture him. If that's the case, I can only try to sneak in. The few large countries wanted to control the right to enter the entire area. Naturally, many organizations, influences, and even other countries expressed their dissatisfaction. This naturally led to the idea of sneaking in. After all, due to the intersecting space-time of the two worlds, the structure of the area was extremely complicated and even dangerous. There were many places that even the military was unable to seal off completely. If that's the case, my cell phone is probably being monitored or even located. Fang Xingjian casually left his cell phone on the bus, got off the bus, and walked to the telephone at the side. Do hello? A clear female voice rang out. Fang Xingjian said calmly, "It's me." The other party's voice turned solemn. "What happened? Why do I feel that the entire city is chasing after you?" This was a lady that Fang Xingjian had gotten to know when he was learning sword techniques in the dojo. She had gradually become Fang Xingjian's best friend. Fang Xingjian asked, "Has the news reached the city bureau?" The lady lifted her head and looked at her colleagues who were in a hurry. As she walked out of the door, she said, "Someone from the upper echelons has given the order to capture you alive." "What on earth did you do?" "Li Shuanghua wanted me to be a witch's slave, so I ran away from home." The policewoman, Jessica, let out a breath and asked, "What do you want me to do?" "I want to go to Miracle World. I know you have a way. Tonight at midnight, same place." Chapter 5. In a dilapidated office building, Fang Xingjian hid in the pitch-black building, looking at the cold streets outside the window. A lady with a height of over 1.8 meters, long legs, and brilliant blonde hair was standing on the streets. Demonic City overlapped with Miracle World and had been divided up by the 5 major countries. The police, fire department, and city government were all jointly enforced by the military forces of various countries. Therefore, there were many white and even black policemen. "There's no one." Fang Xingjian held a pair of binoculars and looked at Jessica on the streets. After half an hour, he walked toward her. "No one is following you, right?" "Of course, no one knows that we're on such good terms." Fang Xingjian asked, "The 5 great clans all have their own secret routes to Miracle World. I wish to go there through the Medici clans." The golden-haired beauty before him was from a branch of the Medici clan, one of the 5 great clans. Like Fang Xingjian, they were both people born in large clans but were not valued by their clans. Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, Jessica frowned and asked, "How much money do you have on hand now?" "My account has been frozen. I have a total of over 2 million on hand," Fang Xingjian said. "That's about it." Jessica nodded. "I'll add another 1,000,000. There's a ship tomorrow night. You could go to Miracle World by sea." Fang Xingjian said hesitantly, "There are many ferocious beasts on the sea route, and there are also tsunamis caused by space-time storms. Isn't it too dangerous?" "How can a route that isn't dangerous be your turn?" Jessica turned and said, Let's go. You can sleep at my place tonight. They probably haven't found out about our relationship yet. A few minutes later, a small car drove Fong Xingjian and Jessica out of the streets. The two of them arrived at a high-rise apartment. Fong Xingjian followed Jessica into the room, and when the door opened, they saw over 10 empty wine bottles on the table. There was also a sink in the kitchen, filled with unwashed plates and instant noodles. Fong Xingjian said helplessly, "Can't you clean it up?" Jessica kicked off her sneakers and lay on the sofa. She casually picked up the half-eaten potato chips and said, "It's good enough that we have a place to stay. Stop being so picky. Do you want some?" Fong Xingjian rolled his eyes, moved away the unwashed lingerie and bras on the other sofa, and then sat down. However, he suddenly felt something hard on his butt. He reached out and touched it. A long vibrator appeared in his hand. Fong Xingjian rolled his eyes at Jessica again. "How long has it been since someone came to your house?" Jessica's face turned red. She snatched the vibrator from Fong Xingjian's hand and said, "I'm 20 years old and single. Can't I have a healthy way to relieve stress?" She casually tossed the vibrator into the room. When she came out, she was only left with her underwear. "I'm going to take a shower. You can find something to eat yourself." Looking at the fleshy body and the voluptuous long legs swaying before him, Fong Xingjian could not help but take a few more glances. Jessica walked into the bathroom and suddenly stuck her head out again. She smiled and said, "Hey, after you go to Miracle World tomorrow, I don't know when you'll be back. Do you want to have a commemorative sex with me today? You're still a virgin, right?" Scram! Fong Xingjian grabbed a tissue box and threw it at her. The latter laughed out loud and hid in the bathroom. "This woman, she's also a virgin, right?" "No, she broke it herself." Fong Xingjian shook his head helplessly, sighed, and then laid down on the sofa. The things that had happened in the past few days kept on replaying in his mind. His grandmother's viciousness, Xingqian's talent, his second uncle's helplessness, and his mother's photo. Many scenes kept on flashing in his consciousness until he finally fell into a deep sleep. "What do you want?" Amidst the darkness, Fong Xingjian opened his eyes, and an extremely familiar voice rang out in his ears. "Who are you? Where's this place?" In the darkness, the other party did not seem to have heard his question and merely continued asking, "What do you want?" At the same time, a hint of purple flames flashed in the darkness. Fong Xingjian looked at the purple flames in astonishment. At the next moment, that voice asked again, "What do you want?" At the next moment, the purple flames burst out with a bright light, and the darkness in the surroundings dissipated completely. Looking at the purple flames that were everywhere, Fong Xingjian's eyes revealed a hint of astonishment. He then sat up from the sofa, his forehead and neck covered in sweat. The sound of water being poured came from the kitchen. Jessica said, "You're awake. I didn't wake you up because I saw you sleeping on the sofa yesterday." She walked out with a cup of coffee and saw Fong Xingjian, who was sweating profusely. She asked curiously, "Not feeling well?" "It's nothing. I just had a nightmare." "All right, I'm going to work now. You can stay here for the rest of the day. Be careful. There's food in the fridge if you're hungry." For the rest of the day, Fong Xingjian stayed at Jessica's house. He also tried to look for news on the internet. However, it was clear that there was no news about him from any of the official channels. As for the dream from the previous night and the illusion in the bamboo forest, although he was a little concerned about it, he still could not find anything after looking up information on the internet. Very quickly, it was midnight. Fong Xingjian hitched a ride with Jessica and arrived at a pier. On the pitch-black pier, a fishing boat shone with sparks as it quietly stopped at the shore. "This is it?" Fong Xingjian asked. I've already made the arrangements. You can go up yourself," Jessica said. Fong Xingjian turned to look at the blonde beauty beside him and said, "Thank you." Jessica smiled and then said solemnly, "I've checked. Fong Xingqian has the talent to become a mage, and under the arrangements of your granny, there's a high chance that he'll be taken in as a disciple by the Mage King. It's best if you never come back." Hearing that, Fong Xingjian clenched his fists tightly. The Mage King was one of the few mages in the entire miracle world who had reached level 30 and possessed the abilities of a divine level mage. Based on the information that Feng Xingjian had seen, a level 30 divine level mage and a level 30 divine level warrior were on two completely different levels. It was like the difference between a nuclear bomb and a fuel air explosive. One was a strategic weapon, while the other was a conventional bomb. Feng Xingjian's clenched fists gradually turned white as he said in a low voice, "I'll be back." With that, he got out of the car and left. Jessica shook her head and looked at Feng Xingjian's back as he left. He walked alone on the pitch-black pier, as if he would be engulfed by the darkness at the very next moment. A hint of reluctance flashed in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if wanting to say something, but in the end, it turned into a sigh. On the other side, Feng Xingjian walked up to the fishing boat and saw a black man standing at the bow of the boat, looking at him. The black man's gaze was like a knife, constantly scanning him up and down as if he was looking at a piece of merchandise. Feng Xingjian frowned, instantly feeling that something was not right. How does he know my name? At the next moment, the sound of wind could be heard, and killing intent encompassed Feng Xingjian's body. He moved, wanting to retreat, but the other party's attacks were much faster. Over 10 streams of sword cheese cut through the air and came toward him. These sword cheese were air shock waves formed by sharp blades cutting through the air. They were sharp sword cheese formed by layers of air molecules being pushed at high speed. The sword cheese were extremely fast, and their prowess was not weak either. As Feng Xingjian tried his best to dodge, he was still slashed by a few streams of sword cheese on his legs and chest. His skin and flesh were immediately lacerated, and the wounds spread out, dyeing his clothes red. This intense pain and the laceration of his muscles caused his body to tremble slightly. A few black narrow swords were already at his neck. Feng Xingjian looked at the 10 or so black men who were surrounding him, dressed in black clothes and pants, looking like ninjas. He said coldly, "Swift Wind Walker, you guys are from the Onassis clan?" The Onassis clan was the only black clan amongst the 5 great clans, and the Swift Wind Walker was a secret job passed down in the Onassis clan. It was a powerful job that could be ranked in the top 30 among all the first transition jobs. It was also a job that only the Onassis clan knew about Magic Prince. The sword cheese from earlier, or air shock waves, or vacuum slashes, were the Swift Windwalker's special extraordinary powers, the job technique. Ha! A delicate laugh rang out, and a bald black woman walked out. Her delicate skin was closer to the color of wheat. Her long neck and sharp chin made her exude a strong feminine charm. Caroline Onassis, who was from the Onassis clan, sized up Feng Xingjian and said, "Take him away." With a bang, Feng Xingjian felt an intense pain at the back of his head, and then he completely fainted. Chapter 6. Under the blue sky and white clouds was a boundless ocean. The fishing boat slowly floated on the surface of the ocean. Caroline Onassis looked at the report in her hands, bored out of her mind. "You're saying that the old woman has no reaction?" In front of her, a black man said, "Yes, I'm afraid it's just as the rumors say. This grandson of hers is not well received by Li Shuanghua." "TSK, I knew it. How could a cold-blooded old woman like Li Shuanghua give up the chance to get close to the Mage King for the sake of a detestable grandson?" Carolyn shook her head and said, "What else did those old fellows say? When can I go back?" "You still need a week. In a week's time, regardless of whether Li Shuanghua has any reaction or not, we have to deal with that brat." "A week?" Carolyn let out a strange cry. "You want me to stay in a godforsaken place with no internet, no cell phones, and no television for a week?" Cold sweat kept dripping down the forehead of the big man as he said softly, "This is the will of the Elders Guild." "A bunch of idiots, old farts, trash," Carolyn shouted. "Who on earth came up with such a stupid idea? My cute little sister? Or that fat uncle of mine with a brain and intestines?" No one answered. At this moment, Carolyn was like a madly roaring lioness. From start to finish, no one dared to respond to her. Carolyn spat and glanced at the big man who was trembling. She suddenly asked, Has that brat woken up? In the darkness of nothingness, purple flames flashed endlessly in the distance. What do you want? Fang Xingjian shouted. Who are you? The voice ignored him and continued. What do you want? I want power. I want to be invincible. Can you give it to me? What do you want? Tisk. Fang Xingjian shook his head. He had been dreaming about the purple flames for the past few days. However, other than asking him what he wanted, there was no reaction no matter what he answered. The next moment, he was drenched from head to toe in cold seawater. Intense pain came from his right hand. Fang Xingjian slowly opened his eyes. A black woman was looking at him with a cruel gaze, like a tiger looking at its prey. Fang Xingjian, you're awake? Fang Xingjian looked at his right hand, which was in excruciating pain. When he saw his bare little finger and a layer of bandage on it, a hint of savagery appeared in his eyes. His little finger had been chopped off. There's no other way. We need something to prove our determination to your grandmother. Carolyn walked up to Fang Xingjian leisurely, touched his cheek, and said, It's a pity that the old woman really doesn't like you. Fang Xingjian stared at her and asked, Who are you? What exactly do you want? Carolyn let out a weird laugh and said, My name is Carolyn Onassis. As for us looking for you, in fact, the matter was very simple. The Black Mage King planned to take in disciples, but there were only 2 candidates. One was Fang Xingqian, and the other was Doris Onassis. And that old woman is only willing to take in 1 disciple. Fang Xingjian looked at Carolyn coldly and said, You guys want to use me to threaten Li Shuanghua? I have to say, this is really a bad move. Ha ha. Carolyn smiled and said, That's right. This is indeed a bad move. We sent her the letter and your finger, but she didn't react at all. However, this is just one of the many attacks. In the coming week, your Fang clan's businesses, territory, and people will all be attacked in all aspects. That old woman won't be able to hold on. But I'm unlucky? Fang Xingjian smiled bitterly and said, You guys not only want to snatch the position of the Black Mage King's disciple, but you also want to push the Fang clan down from the 5 great clans. The Fang clan's strength has long since been on par with ours, but they still have so many businesses that they can't even defend. This is not good. It's not just the other great clans. There are also several multinational corporations and political organizations that have their eyes on the Fang clan. We are the first to make a move, but we definitely won't be the last. Carolyn's finger brushed past Fang Xingjian's shoulder. Then why don't you take a guess? Will I kill you? As she spoke, wherever her finger brushed past, it was as if a blade had flashed past, slicing off a large piece of flesh from Fang Xingjian's shoulder. An agonizing cry came out from Fang Xingjian's mouth. He glared at Carolyn and said coldly, You lunatic. Ha 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 ha. Licking the blood on her finger, she laughed out loud and said, Staying on this boring sea, I've got to find some fun. Carolyn clasped her hands together, and the air in the entire room trembled. Countless air currents rubbed against each other, creating loud, rumbling sounds. It was as if 10,000 horses were galloping, or a waterfall was flowing in reverse. Large-scale air shock waves? Fang Xingjian's eyes narrowed. Is this the Onassis clan's second transition job, atmospheric walker? Carolyn's face revealed a perverted excitement. She looked at Fang Xingjian and shouted, If it's painful, you must cry out. You must cry out. The next moment, countless air currents turned into waves of sword cheese. They kept on rubbing against each other, letting out sharp cries. Then they shot out toward Fang Xingjian. In that instant, Fang Xingjian felt as if he had been tortured by 1,000 cuts. It was as if tens of thousands of small knives were drilling into his body at the same time. Poochie sounds rang out incessantly, and fresh blood was brought out by the atmosphere like fog, dissipating in the entire space. Carolyn allowed the fresh blood to splatter on her body, dyeing her clothes and skin red. Cry out, and enjoy it. A twisted expression of satisfaction appeared on her face, and her eyes gradually glazed over. My dear sister, do you think that just because you become the Black Mage King's disciple, you'll be able to suppress me? I won't let you go. No one can even think of escaping from my hands. Fong Xingjian's face contorted, and his mouth opened, letting out agonizing cries. Huh, guess how much money we spent to bribe your friend? That girl's name is Jessica, right? 5 million USD, and she agreed to bring you here. You really don't have many friends. As she wantonly left scratch marks on Fong Xingjian's body, Carolyn's voice was like the howls of a banshee, continuously entering Fong Xingjian's ears. Huh, Fong Xingjian, you've never known how your mother died, right? Fong Xingjian raised his bloodied head, his eyes like those of a wild beast as he glared at Caroline, as if he wanted to skin her alive. Huh, that's right. That's the gaze. Speaking of which, do you think that your second uncle let you go because it was for your own good? You're really naive. He did it to cripple his nephew's apostle, to pave the way for him to fight for the position of the Fong clan's clan head in the future. Carolyn laughed and shouted. And your mother, ha ha ha, she was a genius who completed the second transition at the age of 16. How could she have died from a difficult birth? Let me tell you, your mother was beaten to death by your maternal grandmother. Do you know? You were destined to be a tragedy from the moment you were born. Impossible. Fong Xingjian shouted furiously. I don't believe it. That's right, Demonic City was only born 16 years ago. My mother was only 16 years old then. How could she have completed the second transition? You're lying. Ha! Do you really think that it was only 16 years ago that someone from Earth went to Miracle World? Carolyn was clearly a veteran in torturing people. Each of her attacks brought Fong Xingjian immense pain and minimal injuries, causing him to suffer endless pain without dying or losing consciousness. What was even more terrifying was her words. Her words were like poisonous daggers, each one piercing deeply into Fong Xingjian's heart. From his life, to his birth, to his mother, to his friends, she continued to torture his soul from all aspects. 2 hours later, Carolyn finally stopped panting. Her face was still flushed from the excitement. She threw a complacent glance at Fong Xingjian before walking out of the door. At the same time, she instructed, treat him. We'll continue tomorrow. Wait a minute. Fong Xingjian lifted his head. There was not an inch of his body that was in good condition, as if he was a ragged toy that had been played with. He struggled to lift his head, looked at Carolyn, and asked, how on earth did my mother die? Ha! I've already told you the answer. What can you do even if you don't believe me? For the next 7 days, Fong Xingjian suffered from Carolyn's inhumane torture every day. At the start, he would still scold and scream, but towards the last few days, he did not even have the strength to speak. A few black men carried Fong Xingjian, who had not a single inch of flesh on his body, onto the deck. Carolyn looked at the lifeless and unresponsive Fong Xingjian, shook her head, and said, how boring. Toss him into the sea. The black guard at the side said, Madam, should we chop off his head before tossing him down? Idiot, we've come all the way from the East China Sea. This is Miracle World. Do you think that he'll be able to survive like this? Carolyn said, the nearest coastline from here is at least 200 kilometers away. Moreover, in a situation where he can't even move his body, wouldn't it be better for him to watch as he is slowly slapped by the seawater and swallowed up by the schools of fish, dying in loneliness and despair? The surrounding black men all shivered as if they were disgusted. They looked at Fong Xingjian with pitiful gazes and lifted him up once again. With a splash, Fong Xingjian was tossed into the sea just like that. Carolyn smiled. All right, we can finally return to Earth. Amidst the sinking and floating seawater, waves of intense pain that could cause one to go into shock came from all over Fong Xingjian's body. He felt as if he had been cut up into pieces and then thrown into a blender to be stirred crazily. When he once again breathed in air, the fishy smell of the sea wafted into his nose. However, right now, Fong Xingjian did not care about this at all. His mind was only filled with endless despair and endless fury burning in his heart. I can't accept this. I can't accept this. Carolyn Onassis, UB*TCH. Many faces flashed through his mind, and many names danced before his eyes. The pain on his body could not compare to the agony in his heart. Fang Xingjian's aura grew weaker and weaker, but he was completely engulfed in hatred and fury. Why is it me? Why is it me? Accompanied by the eruption of hatred, fury, despair, and various other dark emotions, the patterns of the purple flames on Fang Xingjian's body became more and more obvious. In the next moment, the purple flames started to burn from the back of his head. In a short period of time, they had spread to his entire body, turning him into a flaming man. However, even though the flames were clearly burning, when they came into contact with the seawater, they were like illusions. There was no reaction at all. Am I going to die? The pain of being burned by the flames did not come. Instead, waves of numbness and itchiness spread throughout Fang Xingjian's body. He felt as if his injuries had stabilized, and he would no longer die. What is this? Looking at the purple flames on his body, a hint of astonishment flashed across Fang Xingjian's eyes. The injuries on his body continued to heal under the burning of the purple flames. Even his little finger, which had been cut off, was growing back at a speed visible to the naked eye. Chapter 7. Just as Fang Xingjian was wondering what the flames before him were, a large amount of information was transmitted into his mind from the flames. It was not words, nor was it an image, but a more direct meaning. In that instant, it filled up his consciousness, allowing him to understand what the purple flames before him were. By giving, one would receive. By making a wish, as long as one was able to pay a sufficient price, one would be able to obtain anything in the world. Without much thought, Fang Xingjian, who was heavily injured and in a desperate situation, bellowed out his wish towards the flames. Power, give me great power, enough power to completely wipe out the entire Onassis clan. In the next moment, an evil will seem to envelop Fang Xingjian's entire body. Fang Xingjian seemed to hear his own voice ringing out in his mind. This was something using his voice to speak. You can't afford this price. Fang Xingjian frowned. He instantly recalled that he had almost nothing on him right now. Were to get anything to exchange for power. He tried saying, then what do I get? What can I afford? What can you give me? What can allow me to destroy the entire Onassis clan? There was no reply, but an option appeared in Fang Xingjian's eyes. It was also the only option. The world's #1 talent in sword arts. Consume 72 years of your lifespan, leaving you with 5 years of lifespan after the exchange. At the same time, you will never be able to feel love, kinship, or friendship. You will spend the rest of your life alone, without any descendants. From now on, all the happiness in the world will have nothing to do with you. Are you willing? Fang Xingjian's voice rang out in Fang Xingjian's mind. Ha 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 ha. Without any hesitation, Fang Xingjian grinned. I couldn't ask for more. In the next second, an inhuman pain descended from the sky. Fang Xingjian felt as if every bone in his body, every inch of his skin was being torn apart, crushed, and melted in that instant. Almost at the very first moment, Fang Xingjian completely lost consciousness and fainted. However, the changes to his body did not stop. Purple flames soared into the sky, changing his body, consciousness, and brain in a special direction. His eyebrows trembling, Fang Xingjian slowly regained consciousness, but he could still feel waves of pain assaulting his entire body. His broken bones and damaged internal organs made him unable to move, but he could smell the ointment in his nose. Woola walla, waliala. An old man turned around and looked at Fang Xingjian on the bed. He said a bunch of things, but Fang Xingjian did not understand a single one of them. However, he did not say much either. He just stared blankly at the ceiling, as if he was indifferent to everything before him. I'm not dead. Did someone pick it up? Is that flame an illusion? But so what if I don't die? Despair, unwillingness, and anger continued to grow in Fang Xingjian's mind. However, in the next moment, his eyes flashed with disbelief. Name: Fang Xingjian. Age: 16. Occupation: warrior squire level. 9 strength. 9-3 agility. 9-3 reaction. 6-3 endurance. 6-2 flexibility. 6. 2. In brackets were Fang Xingjian's attributes when he was seriously injured. He was not even comparable to a normal person. In fact, if it wasn't for the purple flame preserving his life, he would have died. But this wasn't what he was surprised about. What made him feel different was his skills. Basic sword technique level 3 single. Handed sword technique level 2 cross. / level 2, there was no change in the level, but the mastery required for basic sword technique level 3 to 4 was 0 to 1. The proficiency required to upgrade one-handed sword mastery from level 2 to level 3 was 0 to 1. The mastery required for cross / was also 0 to 1. How is this possible? 1 mastery point is needed to level up? How could this happen? Fang Xingjian looked at the scene with his mouth agape, but he reacted the next moment. The world's best swordsmanship talent? This is the world's best swordsmanship talent? Ha 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 ha. He laughed maniacally, tears flowing down from his eyes. The old man at the side stood up and moved closer to him, letting out muffled cries as if he didn't understand what was going on. But Fang Xingjian didn't care about all this. In his mind, he only wanted to practice his swordsmanship, to swing his sword, to see if he could level up his swordsmanship skills. 3 days later, Fang Xingjian struggled to sit up on the bed. There was no part of his body that didn't feel pain, but he still slowly raised his arm and used his fingers to form a sword. Fang Xingjian felt a surge of power coming from the lower half of his body. It was the explosive power from his muscles, passing through his muscles and connecting to his waist, spine, shoulders, and elbows. It was magnified layer by layer through his joints and bones, turning into a sharp, piercing force that was released from his sword fingers. Using his fingers as a sword and thrusting out, a feeling of enlightenment appeared in Fang Xingjian's heart. The entire movement was as natural as breathing, making him feel as if he had thrust it out tens of thousands of times. However, at the next moment, he let out an agonizing cry and fell onto the bed with a thud. The pain from his body seemed to be 10 times more intense. He had used too much force, causing his wounds to open up again. The old man walked in from outside. Seeing him in this state, he immediately started yelling again. However, Fang Xingjian was all smiles as he focused all his attention on his techniques column. Basic sword technique level 4. Mastery points for leveling up, 0/2. He had managed to level up the technique just by thrusting out with his fingers. Days passed by, and during this period of time, Fang Xingjian didn't waste his time. He tried to learn the language that the old man spoke and was able to carry out some simple communication. The old man seemed to be an ordinary fisherman and seemed to be from a poor family. The ointment that Fang Xingjian had applied was a mixture of herbs and fish blood that he had gathered from an unknown place. According to Fang Xingjian's observations and conjectures, the injuries on his body weren't left by Carolyn. They seemed to have been healed by the purple flames. However, his body seemed to have suffered great damage when the purple flames bestowed upon him the aptitude for sword arts. However, perhaps it was because Fang Xingjian's physical attributes were astonishing, or perhaps it was because of his strong desire to live, or perhaps the ointment was really effective, or perhaps it was because of the purple flames, but the injuries on his body were indeed healing bit by bit. Every few days, he couldn't help but practice his sword techniques with his hands and feet, allowing him to have a rough understanding of his current talent. Even if it was just an ordinary hand gesture, he would still be able to gain proficiency points for the basic sword technique. However, he couldn't gain proficiency points for single-handed sword techniques or the cross/. His basic sword technique had already reached level 10, with a proficiency of 3/20. Every level only required a little bit of proficiency points. This was clearly the effect of the aptitude bestowed upon him by the purple flames. This meant that he had a unique understanding of the sword, and the speed at which he gained proficiency points was very fast. Even if he were to do some hand gestures, he would still gain something. The basic sword technique, which originally required hard work to level up, now seemed very simple, causing the proficiency points required to level up to be pitifully low. Now that the basic sword technique had reached level 10, there were more contents. After increasing the speed and accuracy of his sword, There was an additional 1 point in strength and 1 point in agility. This was a new attribute that would appear when the basic sword technique reached level 10. Fang Xingjian had long known about this. In fact, when most skills were raised to level 10, which was the maximum level for an ordinary person, there would be an additional attribute. Most warriors who practiced the basic sword technique would be able to raise it to level 10, gaining an additional 1 point in strength and 1 point in agility. At this moment, Fang Xingjian felt that both the speed and accuracy of his sword had received a huge boost. When he performed various sword techniques, his entire body was extremely coordinated, as if his muscles had become one. This was a skill level that an ordinary person could only achieve after a few years of training. As for the voice of the purple flames, it never appeared again. Unbeknownst to Fang Xingjian, the purple flame prints on his body had completely disappeared, as if they had never appeared. Chapter 8. Boom, 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 boom. The sound of air being torn apart rang out incessantly, and crackling sounds could be heard coming from the walls. It was the sound of air being compressed and then colliding against the walls. A series of sounds of wind and thunder rang out, as if a thunderstorm was about to descend upon the room. Lad, have you gone crazy again? Are you thinking of smashing everything in the house? The old man stormed in angrily and saw Fang Xingjian sitting on the bed, the wooden rod in his hand drawing out a series of afterimages. It was as if over 10 wooden rods had pierced out in an instant. The next moment, the rod shadows retracted, and Fang Xingjian started coughing violently. There was even blood flowing out from the corners of his mouth. The old man took away the wooden rod in Fang Xingjian's hand, looked at Fang Xingjian, who was coughing incessantly, and said helplessly, "I told you not to move around. Do you want to die? Do you know how serious your injuries are?" Fang Xingjian used the common language, which was not very familiar with, and said, "I don't have much time left." The common language was one of the most widespread languages in Miracle World. In fact, when Fang Xingjian was in Demonic City, he had studied this language. It was just that at the start, the old man's accent was too strong, and he had not been able to tell. Later on, he realized that this was the common language. Since this was Miracle World, he had been chatting with the old man every day, and his standard of the common language had been improving rapidly. It was because he really did not have much time left. Yes, since the sword arts talent mentioned by the purple flames had been given to him, then the so-called lifespan had naturally been taken away as well. Right now, Fang Xingjian was only left with 5 years to live. If he wanted to take revenge in these 5 years, there were too many things he would need to do. Not only did he want to take revenge, but he also wanted to kill Caroline and wipe out the Onassis clan. He also wanted to return to Demonic City, to the Fang clan, to stand before Li Shuanghua and ask her how his mother had died. And all of this required power. At this moment, he looked at his skills column. Although he only sat up to train a little every day, his basic sword technique had already been upgraded to an unprecedented level of 20 with 0 out of 500 proficiency points. A level 20 basic sword technique. One had to know that a normal person's basic sword technique could only be raised to around level 10. Only a few geniuses could surpass this limit and reach level 12, 13, or even 15. However, Fang Xingjian had never even heard of a level 20 basic sword technique, let alone seen one. This was all the result of the change in aptitude. As for the level 20 basic sword technique, aside from increasing the speed and accuracy of the sword, it also increased the attributes of strength by 1 point, agility by 2 points, reaction by 1 point, and flexibility by 1 point. It was equivalent to leveling up by 5 levels. Another 10 days or so passed. Fang Xingjian staggered out of the courtyard. He raised his arm, and instantly, countless black rays of light appeared. They were like huge black pythons tearing through the air, pouncing towards him. The black rays of light came and left quickly. They appeared in an instant and then retracted in an instant, leaving behind a wild howl that filled the air. Following that, he paused for a moment and with a dash, arrived before the mud wall. The tree branch in his hand once again turned into a raging black python, bringing along a graceful arc as it pierced towards the mud wall in front of him. The soles of his feet, calves, thighs, waist, chest, shoulders, and elbows were all connected together. His muscles and bones released a crisp, crackling sound, and Feng Xingjian felt as if he had turned into a sharp sword piercing forward. In that instant, he had stimulated all the power in his body. This instantaneous burst of speed caused a series of ear-piercing whistling sounds in the air. In the end, the tree branch collided with the mud wall, creating an explosion and creating a hole the size of a fist in the mud wall. The level 25 basic sword technique allowed Feng Xingjian's sword speed to be more than twice as fast as before. Even though he was only holding a tree branch, it allowed him to explode with a shocking destructive power. However, this instantaneous burst of speed made his breathing much heavier. After all, he had just been able to stand up and his injuries had yet to recover. Even so, Feng Xingjian still raised his arm again, intending to continue swinging his sword. He no longer had the time. Therefore, as his injuries got lighter, his training became more and more intense. A month later, Feng Xingjian was practicing the entire set of basic sword technique in the courtyard. It was not considered a sword technique, but a training method that included the 12 basic sword moves of hacking, slashing, lifting, blocking, washing, cutting, stabbing, stirring, pressing, hanging, and cloud. This was a basic technique that could be learned in any dojo or academy when he was in Demonic City. Feng Xingjian meticulously executed the basic sword moves of hacking, slashing, stabbing, slashing, and so on, training this set of the simplest basic sword technique. A minute later, the basic sword technique leveled up once again, reaching the unprecedented level 30. Feng Xingjian also felt that the basic sword technique seemed to have reached a limit and could not be improved any further. He looked at his skills column and found that it was indeed the case. There was no longer a requirement for proficiency after level 30 of the basic sword technique, which meant that he had leveled up to the maximum. The attributes that the basic sword technique increased were +2 in strength, +3 in agility, +1 in reaction, and +1 in flexibility. Other than that, he had finally obtained his first specialty. Specialty, genius swordsmanship. Almost perfect mastery of every basic sword move, allowing one to learn any sword technique extremely quickly in the future. Clearly, this was a specialty that increased the speed of learning swordsman-related skills. With Feng Xingjian's aptitude, he was already able to learn very quickly. Now that he had this specialty, he wondered how much more he would be able to improve. A satisfied smile appeared on Feng Xingjian's face. Then the wooden sword in his hand brought along a series of afterimages, flashing across the air like a cross of starlight. The wooden sword had already left a cross-shaped mark on the ground. The entire process of the sword sweeping and hacking seemed to be continuous, leaving no gaps in between. The cross-shaped mark on the ground looked as if it had been carved by a knife or an axe. It was impossible to tell that it had been created by a wooden sword. At level 20, the cross-slash also could not be improved any further. At level 10, the cross-slash had additional attributes of +1 in agility and +1 in flexibility. At level 20, the additional attributes were +1 in strength, +2 in agility, and +2 in flexibility. A carefree smile appeared on Feng Xingjian's face. After practicing swordsmanship for more than 10 years, this was the first time he had such a carefree feeling. His swordsmanship was improving at a speed visible to the naked eye. There were skills leveling up almost every day. In just 1 or 2 months, although he had spent most of his time lying in bed, his progress in swordsmanship was equivalent to that of others who had been practicing for more than 10 years. This feeling of being able to see oneself becoming stronger bit by bit was simply intoxicating. Even so, he continued to practice. Right now, it was no longer effective for him to practice the basic swordsmanship and cross-slash repeatedly. However, his current training was not for these 2 skills, but for his third skill, the single-handed sword mastery. Right now, the single-handed sword mastery had already reached level 19, and it was on the verge of leveling up. Apart from the increased damage that Fang Xingjian could inflict when wielding the single-handed sword due to his familiarity with it, there was also the additional attributes of +1 in strength and +1 in agility after reaching level 10. Fang Xingjian, who was in the courtyard, was repeatedly practicing a series of the most basic moves. It did not look good, but the wooden sword continued to let out thunderous booms as it tore through the air. It made one feel that this sword attack contained great power and speed. After obtaining the genius swordsmanship specialty, Fang Xingjian felt as if he had become one with a long sword in his hand. Every movement, every circulation of force, and the contraction of muscles were as natural as breathing. Finally, Fang Xingjian's movements came to a halt, and a satisfied smile appeared on his cold face. At level 20, the additional attributes were +2 in strength, +2 in agility, and +1 in flexibility. Right now, Fang Xingjian's overall attributes had become: name Fang Xingjian, age 16, occupation warriors, squire, level 9 strength, 14 agility, 16 reaction, 7 endurance, 6 flexibility, 10 inches the short span of 1 to 2 months. Fang Xingjian seemed to have received a qualitative improvement. Moreover, his single-handed sword mastery had yet to reach the maximum level. Even so, the current him could not be compared to a colossus like the Onassis. However, the 1 to 2 months of training had given him great confidence. The current me, as long as I have enough sword techniques, I can continue training endlessly. The maximum level of the skills is high, and the speed of training is many times faster than that of ordinary people. 101,000. As long as I train in enough sword techniques, my strength will continue to increase endlessly. The only thing I need to do is to search for more sword techniques. An ice-cold killing intent flashed in Fang Xingjian's eyes. There seemed to be black flames burning in his eyes. Onassis and Caroline, I won't let you wait for long. Chapter 9. If he wanted revenge, he had to have great power. To Fang Xingjian, if he wanted to possess great power, the best path would be to learn sword arts. And he already had some ideas on how to learn sword arts in Miracle World. This was a world where the development of individual martial arts far surpassed that of Earth. The strongest of the 5 great clans in Demonic City had all obtained a huge amount of resources from the other world. This time around, Fang Xingjian should have been brought to Miracle World by sea after being kidnapped by Caroline. During this period of time, where he was recuperating, it did not hinder him from getting information about this place from the old man. Most of the situation was very close to what he had understood in Demonic City. In this world, levels, attributes, and techniques were all commonplace. They were taken for granted by all the people living here, just like the sky, the sun, and gravity. Although he had long heard rumors about the other world in Demonic City, this was really the first time Fang Xingjian had come to this world. From what the old man had told him, he knew that he was standing on an extremely large continent. Currently, there were a total of 6 countries on this continent, and his current location was near the west coast of the continent's largest country, the Sinkota Empire. However, according to the Demon City government, Earth is only in contact with Uranlis, one of the 6 major countries. The other 5 major countries don't know much about Earth. They might not even know that Uranlis has joined forces with the forces of other worlds. Fang Xingjian thought to himself, this seems to be the case from what I've heard from the old man. Ordinary people have no idea that their world has already been invaded by outsiders. I just don't know to what extent Uranlis and the Earth government are working together. Hey. Fang Xingjian turned his head and saw the old man looking at him with an indifferent expression. The old man held a sword in his hand. The sword was covered in dust, stains, and grease, as if it was a fire stick that had been left in the house all year round. Seeing Fang Xingjian turn his head, the old man stretched out his hand and tossed the sword to Fang Xingjian. Clang! The sword was unsheathed. There was no brilliance, nor was there any threatening chill. It was just an ordinary Western-style one-handed sword. It was 2 meters long and about 3 fingers wide. There were still many nicks on the blade. You brat, you're injured so badly. yet you still practice your sword every day. Do you want to go back and take revenge? Someone who can beat you up like this is not a simple character. Faced with the old man's question, Fang Xingjian did not explain. Shaking his head, the old man continued, "This sword was left behind by me when I was a soldier. Since I have no use for it, you can take it." "Thank you." Fang Xingjian looked at the old man seriously and said. As he spoke, he sheathed his sword and walked towards the door. "Where are you going?" "North, Coster. I heard that there are many places to learn skills and train warriors," Fang Xingjian said. This was a big city closest to the fishing village. He planned to look for opportunities there, gather information, and see if there were any places where he could learn sword arts. He believed that in a world with attributes and skills, where one could train to become stronger, there would definitely be places like sects or associations to train strong warriors. Coster is very far, and the journey is very dangerous. Moreover, it's going to be winter soon. There will be blizzards and hungry wild beasts along the way. Even a large group of warriors might not be able to arrive safely. Aren't you afraid of dying on the way? Even if I die, I'll still go. Pausing for a moment, as if to explain, Fang Xingjian added, I don't have much time left. Indeed, if the will and the purple flames had not lied to him, he only had 5 years left. He really did not have much time left. The old man was silent for a moment before saying, when you reach Coster, if you're not dead and still want to learn sword arts, you could go take a look at the School of Sword Arts. Fang Xingjian turned back, only to see that the old man's brown eyes were slightly dazed, as if he had sunk into some memories. The old man rubbed his eyes, waved his hand, and said, go on. Do what you have to do. Across the entire world, although everyone had the possibility of becoming strong warriors, it might be due to the fact that they were too strong that the development of civilization in the world had slowed down. Countless villages and towns were still in a state of ignorance, and the majority of the people had not been freed from manual labor. It was a little similar to the Middle Ages in Europe on Earth. Moreover, because the average level of the people here was above level 5, most of the commoners had become the main force of manual labor, even more so than the horses. Hurry, we must reach the next campsite by tonight, the blonde manager of the merchant group shouted. In the merchant group, Fang Xingjian had a sword strapped to his waist, and he was carrying goods that weighed over 200 jin on his back, walking forward step by step. In the middle of the night, Fang Xingjian clenched his teeth as he tore at the black bread that was as hard as rocks. He looked at the bonfire with a burning gaze. Amidst the heavy rain, a horse carriage had been washed down a cliff. The managers of the merchant group were frantically urging the laborers and slaves to move, and even they themselves had no choice but to join the team. Fang Xingjian's entire body was drenched by the heavy rain. His feet stepped on the muddy road as he walked up the mountain path. The rain was so cold that it pierced his heart, and the wet goods became increasingly heavy. However, his back remained ramrod straight. This is your pay. A bag of copper coins was thrown in front of Fang Xingjian. Are you really not considering going to Firen with us? It's going to snow soon, and the road to Cursed won't be easy. Thank you. Fang Xingjian accepted the copper coins and turned to leave. This lad, old master is talking to you. The brown-haired, burly man stood up, but was pressed back down by the manager. He looked at the manager, puzzled. Sir? He did not understand why the manager did not allow him to teach that arrogant lad a lesson. Fang Xingjian did not have any extraordinary powers, and it was obvious that he had not gone through the first transition. At most, he was just an ordinary level 9 commoner. The manager shook his head and did not say a word. He only kept his gaze on the worn-out long sword at Fang Xingjian's waist, revealing a solemn expression. Amidst the snowstorm, Fang Xingjian walked toward the north step by step. The frosty rain that was as sharp as knives scraped against his face, and a near 0 degrees Celsius temperature caused his face to turn purple. He could only try his best to shrink his body, wrapping it in his fur, so that it would not be exposed to the wind and snow. Under the starry sky, Fang Xingjian hid in the small hole he had dug. The bonfire beside him grew weaker and weaker, as if it would be extinguished at any moment. He kept shaking his body, as if this could reduce the loss of his body heat. His eyes burned with the flames of vengeance. "Carolyn, Onassis, wait for me." Fang Xingjian sprinted and leaped at high speed. The sword at his waist was unsheathed, and drops of hot blood dripped down from the blade, splattering onto the snow plains, leaving behind a long trail of blood. Tens of huge wolves let out furious and savage howls, chasing after Fang Xingjian. Even the smallest of these huge wolves was over 4 meters long. As they ran, they tore through the air, letting out sharp, whistling sounds, as if they were armored cannonballs. In this digitalized world, humans were not the only ones who could become stronger. There were also many powerful monsters. These monsters were known as ferocious beasts in the world. They were wild beasts that had leveled up after countless battles. These ferocious beasts lived in forests, plains, and rivers. Every year, countless humans traveling in the wild would be killed by them, and then devoured into their stomachs. This world did not just belong to humans. Most commoners who had not gone through the first transition and grasped extraordinary powers might not leave their hometowns for the rest of their lives. With a splash, Fang Xingjian jumped into the stream. The bone-chilling river water almost froze his body in an instant. Turning his head, he saw that the huge wolves had stopped at the shore, hesitating. After chasing for a few hundred meters, they eventually dispersed. After drifting for 2 kilometers, Fang Xingjian finally found an opportunity to climb up to the shore. He immediately took off his clothes and looked for a flint to start fire. He stood beside the bonfire, jumping around, drawing his sword, exercising, and his eyes shone with a beast-like gleam. "I want to live on. Not only must I live on, I must also become stronger and stronger." Amidst the wind and rain, amidst the snow and ice, even in the loneliest night, Fang Xingjian did not fall. He kept his back straight, and his eyes shone with a wolf-like gleam. He kept thinking about that night in the ancestral hall, thinking about the days he had spent in it. Those scenes kept replaying in his mind, causing his heart to turn colder and colder, and the fire in his eyes to burn brighter and brighter. A man stood in front of Cursed City Gate. His clothes were tattered, and his hair was long and tangled. He looked like a refugee who had escaped from the dirtiest and lowliest commoner district. The man's lips were chapped, and his face was pale. His cheeks were emaciated, as if he had gone through a famine. Only the man's eyes were still bright, like the stars in the night sky. "I'm finally here." Cursed. The man was naturally Fang Xingjian. He lowered his head and looked at his specialties window. Unknowingly, there had been an additional specialization. Elementary survival instinct. Increases your endurance and willpower, allowing you to ignore pain and endure hunger and cold. All non-fatal injuries will not stop you from fighting and struggling. Chapter 10. In the west of Cursed, in the commoner district's Torch Tavern, there was a hubbub of activity everywhere. The smell of low-quality cigarettes and alcohol, as well as the stench of sweat that came from not bathing for a few days or even more than 10 days. As the busiest tavern in the commoner district, it was filled with all sorts of gangsters, ruffians, laborers at the bottom of society, drunkards, gamblers, prostitutes. Have you heard? Feiyang Night Academy is recruiting again. I'm planning to give it a try. Ah, with just you? I remember that you took 5 years to reach the maximum level for one of your basic skills. Have you heard? Uranlis United Nations in the north has discovered traces of demons. Umphumph, is it the doing of those blasphemers again? Fang Xingjian heard the news one after another. This was already his 3rd day in Cursed. In these 3 days, he had gotten a general idea of the city's situation. As one of the biggest cities on the west coast of the Sinkota Empire, Cursed was not only a huge port for ocean trade, but also one of the political and economic centers of the west coast. Here, people with black hair and eyes like it could often be seen. It was said that on the other side of the sea, in the distant western land, people like him could be found everywhere. However, Fang Xingjian knew that although they looked similar, they were not Asians from Earth. As the political and economic center, as well as a trading port, the whole of Cursed was exceptionally prosperous. Here, there were many organizations that provided learning and leveling up opportunities. as a world that was used to leveling up techniques, specialties, and attributes. The people in this world, even the elderly and children, had bodies that far surpassed those on Earth. They even learned some martial arts techniques to some extent. Here, leveling up and becoming stronger was a matter of course. Everyone hoped to be able to change their lives through power. And in Cursed, putting aside the ordinary warrior schools, martial arts academies, dojos, and the like, the 7 most famous places in the city that provided learning of martial arts were collectively known as the 7 Pearl Academies. The so-called Pearl referred to the Empire's west coast, Cursed. According to Feng Xingjian's inquiries, there were 2 schools in the 7 Pearl Academies that were famous for their sword arts and techniques. They were the School of Sword Arts and Treja Knight Academy. Treja Knight Academy's founder, Dave Treja, was a divine level expert who had reached level 30 over 100 years ago. Over the years, he had nurtured batches of famous experts, famous generals, and experts. Although Treja Knight Academy had weakened over the years, it was still one of the top 3 academies in the 7 Pearl Academies. As for the School of Sword Arts, it paled in comparison. First of all, the School of Sword Arts in Cursed was just a branch. The real headquarters of the School of Sword Arts was located in the Empire's capital, Diha. It was a super academy that had once been equally famous throughout the entire empire. However, as the previous headmaster of the School of Sword Arts in Cursed had been defeated in a duel and died from serious injuries, and the current headmaster was too young and not strong enough, the school had been on a decline for the past few years. It was now ranked last among the 7 Pearl Academies, and was even considered inferior to the other 6 academies. However, there was something very strange. It had been 3 days since Feng Xingjian had arrived in Cursed, but he had not heard anything about the Magic Prince. It was as if job transitions using Magic Prince had never happened in this world. In this world, job transitions that had been passed down since ancient times were still being carried out, and all the secret methods were monopolized by the various large organizations and the royal family. Moreover, their understanding of mages was very shallow, and most of the commoners did not even understand how powerful mages were. Their understanding of this information was even worse than that of many cultivators in Demonic City. Did the mages themselves seal off the news? Feng Xingjian thought to himself, or is it really as the government said, that things like Magic Prince were developed by Earthlings themselves? Feng Xingjian could not think of a reason, and could only continue to listen to the rumors around him. Hey, have you heard? The Black Mage King has taken in another personal disciple. Oh, I wonder who is so unlucky to have been taken by those blasphemers for research. Hearing this news, Feng Xingjian's expression froze. Mage King, Onassis. Feng Xingjian's fists were clenched so tightly that they turned slightly white, and there seemed to be a fire burning in his heart. Every second, every sentence, and every word that had been said during those 7 days had been remembered clearly in his heart. Uranlis, one of the 6 great countries in the world, was a country ruled by mages. The 3 strongest mages were also the only ones who had reached the divine level of level 30. They were known as the Mage Kings. Amongst them, the Black Mage King was the one who was the most interested in Earth, and the one who was the most supportive of the 2 sides working together and interacting. Earth, Demonic City, Magic Prince, Onassis clan, Mage King, everything seemed to be connected together. Feng Xingjian instinctively felt that there was some secret hidden within, but he also knew that this was not the time to be bothered about this. Learning sword techniques and becoming stronger were the most important things for him now. Then it must be the School of Sword Arts, Treja Knight Academy, nurtured nobles and retainers. Other than martial arts, one also had to learn various skills such as etiquette, theology, language, military affairs, administration, and many others, as well as various references, qualifications, and backgrounds. The School of Sword Arts, where anyone could enroll, was more suitable for Feng Xingjian. In particular, it was rumored that the School of Sword Arts had collected many sword techniques that had been passed down from generation to generation. This was something that Feng Xingjian had set his eyes on. Therefore, the next morning, Fang Xingjian arrived early at the entrance of the School of Sword Arts, located on a street in the east of the city. The deserted streets, the rusted metal door, and not even a single gatekeeper. It seemed that the School of Sword Arts had indeed fallen into dire straits. Fang Xingjian tried to push the door, only to discover that it was not locked at all. He took a big stride and walked in. After turning a corner, he could see over 10 students holding long swords and practicing their sword techniques, sparring with each other. A young man dressed in gray training clothes was walking on the training grounds, guiding the students as they practiced their sword techniques. The young man had blonde hair and his eyes were closed. He looked thin and malnourished, and his training clothes had been washed so many times that it had turned white. There were even a few patches on it, and he looked poor and dejected. The only thing that made him different from ordinary people was his slightly heroic aura. Seeing Fang Xingjian appear, the young man revealed a friendly and expectant smile. Even though Fang Xingjian looked like a penniless vagabond, there was no hint of impatience in his eyes. "Hello, I'm the owner of the School of Sword Arts, Kyle. Are you here to learn sword techniques?" The School of Sword Arts has a history of 150 years and is the best place to learn sword techniques in the world. I see that your fingers are long and slender, and your limbs are strong. You're definitely a good candidate for sword techniques. How about it? As long as you practice here, we'll assign you a first transition job. As long as you pay the school fees, you'll be free to learn all sword techniques. Fang Xingjian was stunned. It seemed that the situation in the School of Sword Arts was even worse than what the rumors had said. He interrupted him and said directly, "I'm here to learn sword techniques." "Oh." Kyle smiled. All right. But you'll have to pay the school fees first. They'll be paid every half a year, and there'll be 30 copper coins in total. 30 copper coins. The money that Fang Xingjian had earned on the way here was about 100 copper coins. The school fees were really not expensive. He nodded and passed the money to the young man. Kyle happily accepted the money, a relaxed smile on his face. All right. Come, I'll teach you the basic sword technique of the School of Sword Arts, the grizzly bear sword technique. With that, Kyle picked up a wooden sword and started practicing. Chapter 11. After Kyle finished speaking, he raised the wooden sword in his hand, and a powerful aura was released. With a thrust and a sweep, the faint sound of wind and thunder could be heard. At the same time, he explained, the School of Sword Arts has 150 years of history and was founded by the people of the Western Land who came to the Empire. However, in the past 150 years, there have been many sword arts geniuses, and the sword arts of the School of Sword Arts have long broken away from the style of the Western Land sword arts and have become one of its own. This grizzly bear sword technique was invented and improved by several generations of sword arts masters. The muscles all over his body twisted continuously. Although he was only using the sword in his hand, it was as if all the muscles in his body had been twisted into a single line. However, it was different from the human body, as it vibrated with a unique rhythm, like a black bear standing on its hind legs, swaying left and right, training the strength of its four limbs, chest, and abdomen. There are 4 types of martial arts: nurturing, training, development, and killing. The so-called nurturing refers to the accumulation of the body's potential. Just like how a good sword needs to be nurtured daily, smeared with sword oil, and polished to become sharper, the human body is the same. It needs to be nurtured carefully in order to build a strong foundation for the improvement of the body. The grizzly bear sword technique is a nurturing technique created by generations of sages by observing the movements of bears and simulating the grizzly bear's form. If one practices it for a long time, they will be able to twist the human body into a single line and attain the strength of a bear. As he spoke, the wooden sword in Kyle's hand vibrated intensely, leaving behind a series of afterimages. His entire body swelled up like a grizzly bear awakening from its deepest hibernation, exploding with the most ferocious strength hidden within its body. With a soft rumble, like the roar of a bear, Kyle pierced forth with his sword, bringing with it a gust of wind that blew away the leaves within 10 feet of him. When a bear hibernates, its whole body will tremble every few days. Otherwise, the muscles and blood will stiffen and the body will be damaged. When we practice the grizzly bear sword technique, the most important thing is this trembling. It is like the sound of spring thunder, causing all living things to grow. This trembling is the nurturing technique, and it contains the mysteries of nurturing the body. After demonstrating a set of the grizzly bear sword technique, Kyle sheathed his sword and turned to look at Feng Xingjian. He smiled and said, "However, although this set of sword technique looks simple, the weight, advance and retreat, and left and right all need to be grasped and adjusted bit by bit. It's impossible to master in a short period of time. I'll teach you a few simple moves today." It could be seen that Kyle, who had accepted the tuition fees, was indeed very responsible, not holding anything back. He slowly explained the secrets of the grizzly bear sword technique to Feng Xingjian. Of course, this was also because there were countless similar nurturing techniques in the world. Although the grizzly bear sword technique was powerful, it could not be considered an ultimate technique. However, from this point alone, it could be seen that the martial arts system on the continent was very developed and even systematic, becoming a unique culture of this world. As he listened to Kyle's explanation, Feng Xingjian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. Although this was the first time he had heard such an explanation of martial arts, he had a feeling of sudden enlightenment and clarity. In the next moment, a new skill appeared in his skill pane. Grizzly Bear Sword Technique Level 1 raises the potential of a human body and has the effect of gradually increasing one's strength and agility attributes. Not only that, with Kyle's explanation and demonstration, he also started to practice the Grizzly Bear Sword Technique along with him. After a few minutes, Kyle had already stopped what he was doing. He stared at Feng Xingjian with wide eyes, as if he was looking at a monster. As Feng Xingjian waved the wooden sword in his hand, his entire body trembled along with the sword's tip. With each tremble, it was as if all the muscles in his body were breathing along with the sword, or as if a grizzly bear was leaning against a tree and scratching an itch. All the muscles and bones in his body were trembling together. How is this possible? When I first saw him practicing the grizzly bear sword technique, he was clearly flustered, unable to control his weight, and his breathing was heavy. It was as if he had never practiced before. How is it that in just a few minutes, he has already become so proficient in the grizzly bear sword technique, as if he had put in a few months of hard work? On the other side, Feng Xingjian was still immersed in the thrill of improving his sword techniques. He had already been bestowed with the world's best talent in sword arts by the Purple Fire, and after he had reached level 30 in the basic sword technique, he had also obtained the specialty genius swordsmanship, allowing him to pick up any sword techniques extremely quickly. In just a few minutes, he had already reached the 3rd level of the grizzly bear sword technique, which was equivalent to half a year's worth of hard work for an ordinary person. Although there was no increase in his attributes with the 3rd level of the grizzly bear sword technique, he felt as if all the muscles and bones in his body were immersed in a warm, hot spring, as if they were being massaged by countless hands. It was also at this moment that he suddenly noticed the strange expression on Kyle's face and slowed down the progress of his sword techniques. "Teacher, this set of sword technique gives me a very familiar feeling. There are many similarities with the basic sword technique I had practiced in the past." Oh, with that, Feng Xingjian demonstrated his basic sword technique to Kyle. The latter nodded his head with a look of admiration in his eyes. Although this set of sword technique is simple and crude, it contains most of the sword techniques in the world. The rarest thing is that your foundation is so strong that it's something I've never seen before. Coupled with your talent in sword arts, it's no wonder that you've picked up the grizzly bear sword technique so quickly. However, the beginning of the grizzly bear sword technique is easy, but you'll have to spend more time and effort in controlling the circulation of energy in your body. Kyle thought that he had found the reason why Feng Xingjian could practice the grizzly bear sword technique so quickly. He nodded his head in admiration and put in even more effort in teaching Feng Xingjian. Feng Xingjian's talent was outstanding, but he was still able to lay down such a strong foundation in the way of the sword. This made him appreciate Fang Xingjian even more. On the other side, Fang Xingjian did not dare to put in any more effort in his practice and was just going along with it. He knew that the talent he had displayed now far surpassed that of an ordinary person. But if the other party were to find out that he had reached level 20 or 30 in just a few days, he would no longer be considered talent, but a demon. It would be fine if the other party appreciated him, but if someone felt that there was a problem with his talent and wanted to study it or suppress it, it would be pointless trouble. Once his demon-like talent was exposed, there were only two outcomes that awaited him. He would either be suppressed to death or be controlled by someone else, becoming a chess piece in someone else's hands. And now, Fang Xingjian only wanted to hide in the School of Sword Arts and learn all the sword techniques here to increase his abilities. Therefore, in the next few days, Fang Xingjian only displayed the level of the grizzly bear sword technique when he met Kyle, but he continued to practice in private and managed to achieve consecutive breakthroughs, reaching level 12 in the grizzly bear sword technique. And when he reached level 10 in the grizzly bear sword technique, he finally received additional attributes. They were A+2 to strength and +2 to agility, increasing the body's potential and increasing the recovery rate of muscle and bone fatigue. Chapter 12. During this period of training, Fang Xingjian had a deeper understanding of the School of Sword Arts' dire straits. It could be said that the School of Sword Arts was being supported by Kyle alone, from lecturing to cleaning. Those who came here to learn sword arts were basically the children and youths of the neighborhood. On this day, Kyle was explaining the profoundness of the classification of martial techniques to his disciples. There are 4 types of martial techniques: nurturing, training, amassing, and killing. Kyle stood in front of over 10 disciples, speaking with assurance and composure. Everyone was listening attentively. In this world where strength was everything and where personal strength determined one's future, for ordinary people, or rather commoners, raising their battle prowess was the only way for them to stand out. Learning martial arts was the happiest thing for them and the best way out. This was also the choice of many commoners. Many families would invest most of their resources into their children's martial arts training. Kyle continued, 50 years ago, a divine level expert, the Rose Knight, wrote the flower sword technique. He used the 4 seasons of a year to describe the 4 types of martial arts: nurturing, training, amassing, and killing. This is also a common description used by later generations, and I like it very much. It says that nurturing is like spring, nourishing all living things, nurturing the body, increasing one's potential, allowing one's physical body to grow naturally, just like a seed being planted in spring to grow strong and healthy. Training is like the scorching heat of summer, using extreme training to hammer the physical body, squeezing out one's potential, and exploding all the energy gained from the nurturing technique. But it is precisely because of this that I have never taught you. It's because your nurturing technique is insufficient and your body's potential is insufficient. Training in the training technique now is just squeezing out your life force and overdrafting your potential. The normal procedure is to wait until your basic sword techniques have been trained to perfection, which is level 10 or above, before moving on to the training technique. As for amassing amidst the deep autumn, it's the harvest of life and also the death of all living things. The emphasis is on hiding vitality within the silence. This describes the improvement of one's physique through breathing and blood flow. It's the evolution of life itself. However, the amassing technique is too profound, and it also has a high requirement for one's aptitude. It's not time for you to learn it yet. Looking at the dispirited expressions on the faces of many of the disciples, Kyle smiled and continued. The final killing technique is easy to explain. It's a technique used purely for battle and massacre. It's like the bitter cold of winter, wiping out all life. This skill is completely different from the ordinary skills that help you train your bodies. Teacher, when will you teach us killing techniques? A brown-haired young man who was less than 20 years old raised his hand and asked. The young man was nearly 9 meters tall and had a sturdy body. He looked like a small mountain. His name was Ogden, and he was considered the student who had stayed in the School of Sword Arts the longest. He could be considered the eldest martial brother of the School of Sword Arts. Whether it was his attributes or skills, he was the undisputed #1 player in the team. Hearing Ogden's question, Kyle smiled and shook his head, saying, "You guys are still building your foundations. If you were to learn killing techniques too early, it wouldn't be beneficial to your body's maintenance and training." All right, that's all for today. Next, let's practice the grizzly bear sword technique. Just then, Fong Xingjian, who was at the back row, raised his hand and asked, "Teacher, I have a question." Seeing that it was Fong Xingjian who had raised his hand to ask a question, Kyle's eyes shone with encouragement. He had seen Fong Xingjian's hard work and aptitude for the past few days, and his admiration for this student grew. "Go ahead. I'd like to ask, when we practice sword techniques, most of them will have the effect of increasing our attributes after reaching level 10. What is the principle behind this? If a person were to practice a few hundred sword techniques to level 10, wouldn't he be invincible?" This was a question that had surfaced in his mind recently. It also affected whether his strength would continue to grow like this in the future. Hearing Fong Xingjian's question, Kyle smiled and said, "First of all, it's quite impossible for a person to master a few hundred sword techniques. A warrior with an ordinary aptitude would need hundreds of thousands or even millions of experience points to master just one set of sword technique. Usually, it would take them 5 to 10 years to push their sword technique to level 10. A few hundred sword techniques would take an ordinary person thousands of years to master. Even those rumored geniuses who could learn 10 times faster than ordinary people would still need hundreds of years of practice to reach the 10th level of a sword technique in half a year to a year without eating or drinking. Of course, there are some rumored geniuses who can do this, but there are only a few of them every few decades. You might not even see one in your lifetime." After saying this, Kyle muttered to himself for a moment, then continued to talk about Fong Xingjian's other question. As for the problem of increasing attributes with level 10 techniques, the theory behind it is too profound. Even the experts in the headquarters might not be able to research it thoroughly. However, there are some theories that most experts agree with. That is, when a new technique reaches level 10, it will give a human body a better way of circulating, reducing the resistance and clumsiness between the muscles, bones, and tendons, allowing one's strength, agility, and other attributes to be better unleashed. It's said that the higher-ups in the Royal Knight Academy had once done an experiment. If similar techniques were to reach level 10, only one of them would increase the attributes. It should be the same principle. Of course, the nurturing and hairpin techniques that strengthen the physical body, polish one's foundation, and nurture one's potential are not included in this list. Those are methods that fundamentally change one's physique and increase one's attributes. However, for the same type of hairpin techniques and nurturing techniques, when they reach level 10, I'm afraid that they will still overpower each other. Hearing Kyle's words, a hint of understanding flashed in Fong Xingjian's eyes. The additional attributes of sword techniques were actually the increase in attributes brought about by the increase in the technique. Simply put, if a person's muscles had a total of 1 ton of strength, they would only be able to unleash a force of 100 gene due to the mutual obstruction between the muscles and bones. Then, after learning martial arts, they would know how to exert strength, reducing the internal friction in the bones and muscles during the process of transferring strength, allowing them to unleash a force of 200 gene. The additional attributes of the sword techniques that Fong Xingjian was currently practicing were these additional 100 gene. So that's how it is? If that's the case, only one of the same sword techniques can provide me with additional attributes at level 10. Does that mean that it won't have any effect on me? However, I'll have to practice to know. Anyway, with my current aptitude and learning speed, I'll be able to pick up most sword techniques the moment I learn them and master them the moment I use them. I'm not afraid of learning more sword techniques. Next, Kyle guided everyone in practicing the grizzly bear sword technique. This basic sword technique of the School of Sword Arts was extensive and profound. It was easy to learn, but difficult to master. However, it was an excellent technique that could improve one's physique and increase one's potential. Basically, everyone in the School of Sword Arts had to practice it many times a day. However, after a few rounds of practice, Kyle pointed at eldest martial brother Ogden and shook his head, saying, "What's wrong with you? How many times have I said it?" The grizzly bear sword technique requires ingenuity and mental strength. The crux is that tremble. You've been training so hard that you've never been able to break through to level 10. Every time you practice the grizzly bear sword technique, do you lose your proficiency? Ogden lowered his head in acknowledgement, saying with some grievance, "I've been practicing for more than 8 hours a day, but I don't know why. But ever since I reached level 9 in the grizzly bear sword technique, my proficiency has never increased." Kyle was naturally aware of how hardworking Ogden was. For a commoner like him, the only way out was to practice martial arts. Ogden had been training at the School of Sword Arts since he was 8 years old, and his physical body had been tempered to a level far beyond that of an ordinary person. His strength, agility, and endurance had all exceeded 15 points, and his attributes had increased through training. Other than leveling up and the increase in his skills, his attributes had also increased through daily training. For example, the grizzly bear sword technique of the School of Sword Arts had a miraculous effect on increasing one's strength and agility through training. However, there was a limit to such training. The higher one's physical attributes were, the weaker the training would be. Ogden's current level 9 grizzly bear sword technique no longer had any effect on his physical body. If he wanted to continue improving his attributes through training in the grizzly bear sword technique, he would have to break through the bottleneck in the grizzly bear sword technique. Kyle shook his head and pointed at Feng Xingjian, saying, "Come, demonstrate the few moves you made earlier. All of you, watch carefully." Chapter 13. Feng Xingjian was not surprised. He walked up with the wooden sword he used for practice and began to practice the grizzly bear sword technique. However, he tried his best to appear clumsy, making it seem like he was at level 2 or 3. Even so, he was still able to demonstrate the essence of the grizzly bear sword technique, causing Kyle's eyes to light up once again. Not bad, not bad. Take a good look. The grizzly bear sword technique requires you to move your neck, chest, and arms like a bear. The neck needs to be relaxed, and the waist needs to be shaken. Xingjian's skill level is not as high as yours, but his skill is something that you must learn. He is already on the path, waiting to reach the finish line. But some of you have gone in a big circle and are still going in circles at the finish line. Seeing that Feng Xingjian had finished practicing, Kyle nodded his head in satisfaction. Not bad. Xingjian, go and practice by yourself. With that, he turned to Ogden and said, "Did you see that? Learn more. Although your sword technique level is higher than Feng Xingjian's, you have not truly grasped its essence. From now on, his practice of the grizzly bear sword technique will be smooth sailing. He won't have as many bottlenecks as you. Continue to practice. If you don't break through to level 10, how are you going to pass the prefectural selection?" Feng Xingjian walked to the side and began to practice the grizzly bear sword technique. The prefectural selection that Kyle had mentioned flashed through his mind. The upper echelons of the empire were almost all controlled by the aristocrats, the royal family, and other aristocratic families. If an ordinary person wanted to improve, become stronger, and enjoy more resources for cultivation, the only way was to join them. Unlike the second generation who were born with a silver spoon and had all sorts of inheritance rights, recommendation rights, and other ways to improve, the only way for commoners to rise up was through the nation selection. The nation selection was divided into 3 stages: the prefectural selection, the regional selection, and the national selection. The prefectural selection was held once a year, the regional selection was held once every 2 years, and the national selection was held once every 3 years. At each stage, there were hundreds or even thousands of people who were favored by the heavens. And after each stage, they would receive various privileges and rewards given by the nation. For example, the right to enter the Royal Academy, the title of nobility, land, manners, tax exemption, and even job changes would be provided. If you didn't participate in the national selection, no matter how outstanding your cultivation was, you would only be a commoner. It could be said that the national selection was the best way out for the commoners, and it also selected a large number of talents for the empire every year. An ordinary class change can be completed in any of the schools. But how can the resources of a sect compare to a large country? Fang Xinjian had already made up his mind. I must participate in the national selection. Starting from the upcoming prefectural selection 5 months later, I must obtain the identity of a knight and enter Kurst's Royal Academy. Yes, the head of Kurst's 7 Pearl Academies was Kurst's Royal Academy, which only those who had passed the prefectural selection and become a knight could enter. At the thought of this, Fang Xinjian's eyes narrowed. The wooden sword in his hand seemed to have become even more vigorous and heavy. As he cultivated his sword technique, his mind kept thinking. Regarding the matter of living expenses, I might be able to think of a way to get help from the School of Sword Arts. But the most important thing is to cultivate my sword techniques and prepare to participate in the prefectural selection. Of the Empire selections, the prefectural selection was held once a year, the regional selection once every 2 years, and the national selection once every 3 years. Coincidentally, it's this year's prefectural selection, next year's regional selection, and the year after the national selection. I only have 5 years to live, and this is the only chance I have. If I want to seek revenge and become stronger, I must continue to advance. I must make use of the Empire's resources in addition to my talent. After passing the prefectural selection and becoming a knight, the Empire would groom you for your first job transition, which was the first transition. After passing the regional selection and becoming a conferred knight, the Empire would groom you for your second job transition, which was the second transition. After passing the national selection and becoming a knight, the Empire would groom you for your third job transition, which was the third transition. This was the process of a warrior rising from level 1 to level 30 after joining the Empire. As he spoke, his technique's window jumped once again. His grizzly bear sword technique had leveled up once again, reaching level 18. Ordinary people can only train up to level 10, but I can greatly surpass this limit. No problem. As long as I continue to improve like this, I'll become strong enough. Once again, sparks of hatred flashed in Fang Xinjian's eyes. Li Shuanghua's viciousness and Caroline's torture were like venomous snakes tearing at his soul. He lifted his head and looked around. On the training grounds, regardless of whether it was children of 8 or 9 years old, youths in their teens, or youths in their 20s, all of them were immersed in their training, sweating profusely. There was not a single person slacking off. The culture of individual martial arts in Miracle World was indeed many times more developed than in Demonic City. More than half of the students in the training grounds were stronger than the Fang Xinjian he had been in Demonic City. In the middle of the training grounds, Kyle finished guiding a group of students and shouted, "All right, I'll be heading out for a while. I might not be able to stay for long due to some matters. Everyone, if you have any questions, you can just communicate with each other." At the next moment, Fang Xinjian turned his head and saw eldest martial brother Ogden walking toward him. His well-trained body seemed to be on the verge of bursting out of his training clothes, and with each step he took, the ground would tremble slightly. Although Fang Xinjian knew that Teacher Kyle was definitely stronger than eldest martial brother, in terms of aura alone, this eldest martial brother's pressure was even greater than Kyle's. Moreover, Ogden had been training in the School of Sword Arts since young, training his body. Moreover, the School of Sword Arts did not only have the grizzly bear sword technique. It was just that Ogden needed a breakthrough in the grizzly bear sword technique. Looking at Fang Xinjian, this eldest martial brother smiled and said, "Junior martial brother Xinjian, teacher said that your grizzly bear sword technique is better than mine. I wonder if I can practice with you?" Fang Xinjian glanced at him. He had just arrived and should not make enemies. Moreover, Ogden did not have any ill intentions. Even if he did not agree, could he not practice with him? Therefore, Fang Xinjian nodded and said, "It's fine." Ogden nodded gratefully. "Thank you." I've taken the prefectural selection 3 times, but I've never passed. If I still can't pass this time, my father has already arranged a job for me as a city guard. Therefore, I must definitely pass this prefectural selection. Therefore, Fong Xingjian continued his practice, while Ogden followed beside him, imitating Fong Xingjian's movements to practice the grizzly bear sword technique. Fong Xingjian did not pay any attention to him, only minding his own business as he practiced his sword techniques. But unknowingly, when the others saw that even Ogden was practicing the grizzly bear sword technique with Fong Xingjian, 5 or 6 young boys who had just learned the technique also came over to practice with Fong Xingjian. This Fong Xingjian is really amazing. I feel that his sword techniques are similar to Teacher Kyle's. They're really similar to Teacher Kyle's. This is great. If we keep practicing with him, we'll be able to correct our own movements. Just as more than half of the students were practicing the grizzly bear sword technique with Fong Xingjian, in another corner, a few boys were looking at Fong Xingjian with unfriendly expressions. A red-haired boy with a gloomy expression mumbled, "This lad is really insolent. Does he want us, the seniors who have been training for a few years, to learn from him?" Beside him was a boy with a slender figure and well-proportioned muscles. He was like a perfect statue. His name was Lambert, and he could be considered the second most senior student in the School of Sword Arts. He was often addressed as second martial brother. Like Ogden, he was at the pinnacle of level 9, but had yet to complete his job transition. Furthermore, he was proficient in many sword techniques, and his abilities were only below Ogden's. His companions said, "That's right. He's only been here for a few days, and he's already teaching us sword techniques. Why don't we teach him a lesson? What's there to teach?" Lambert laughed coldly and turned around. "Remember, the prefectural selection is our goal. This time around, I will definitely leave this place and enter the Royal Academy. And he still has to train for a few more years in the School of Sword Arts. What's there to fuss about? All right, hurry up and train." There are only 5 months left before the prefectural selection. After a few hours, even with Fong Xingjian's strong body, he could feel the muscles in his limbs and torso aching. He immediately stopped, as if to take a break. After all, he was a human and not a machine. Once his body felt tired, he had to rest. Otherwise, if he continued, he would not be nurturing his body, but destroying it instead. On the other hand, Ogden, who was beside him, still looked energetic, as if he did not feel tired at all. As for the other students, they had already left for lunch. Ogden saw that Fong Xingjian had stopped and asked, "Xingjian, are you going to rest?" I'll go for lunch after I rest a bit." "Oh, then you go first. I'm feeling a little better now, so I'll continue to train." Fong Xingjian did not say anything else and headed straight for the canteen. Ever since he had arrived in this world, he had realized that his emotions seemed to have become more and more indifferent. Although he knew that it was best to have a good relationship with others, he could not bring himself to say it. Chapter 14. The world's best sword arts talent will cost you 72 years of your lifespan, leaving you with 5 years of your remaining lifespan. You will never be able to feel love, kinship, or friendship. You will spend your entire life alone, without any descendants. From then on, all the happiness in the world will have nothing to do with you. Are you willing? Of course. Of course, I wanted to take revenge. How could I not want power? On the training grounds, thinking of the price he had paid, Fong Xingjian's eyes once again burned with a cold, killing intent. The speed of the long sword in his hand increased rapidly, as if wanting to destroy everything in front of him. Xingjian, are you all right?" Fong Xingjian regained his senses, only to find that everyone was looking at him in shock. The tip of his sword was pressed against the chest of a student. "I'm sorry, I need to rest for a while." Shaking his head, Fong Xingjian kept his sword and walked towards a corner. Another 10 days passed. Looking at his stats window, he saw that the grizzly bear sword technique had reached level 27. The additional attributes were now +4 in strength and +4 in agility, greatly increasing the potential of the human body, as well as the recovery rate of muscle and bone fatigue. Other than the increase in attributes brought by the release of his physical potential, the effects of his daily practice of the grizzly bear sword technique far surpassed that of ordinary students. Almost every day, he could feel his muscles and bones growing like seeds, as if he had once again returned to being a fetus. His daily appetite had also greatly increased. Although there were no changes to the 5 major attributes on his stats window, he believed that after practicing the grizzly bear sword technique for a long period of time, it was only natural that his physical body would become stronger and his attributes would increase. In the past half a month, Feng Xingjian had also learned the eagle sword technique and the tenor-style body strengthening sword technique from Kyle. The eagle sword technique was also one of the basic sword techniques of the School of Sword Arts. Complementing the grizzly bear sword technique, it could fully develop the potential of the human body and strengthen the attributes of the human body. As for the tenor-style body strengthening sword technique, it was a basic two-handed sword technique created by the Empire's sword saint, John Tenor. Due to its outstanding effects in training the human body's agility, reaction, footwork, and joints, it was widely promoted in the military. Later on, it was also adopted by various academies and factions, becoming a compulsory basic two-handed sword nurturing technique. In just over 10 days, not only had Feng Xingjian's grizzly bear sword technique reached level 27, his eagle sword technique and tenor-style body strengthening sword technique had also reached level 12 and 9 respectively. The eagle sword technique had received its first attribute bonus, agility +1, reaction +1, endurance +1, flexibility +1, and increased the body's potential, physical strength, and agility. As for the tenor-style body strengthening sword technique, he was about to make a breakthrough. He decided to work harder and practice until he reached level 10. Moreover, due to his hard work every day, his endurance attribute had increased by 1 point. If others were to find out that he had completed the cultivation that would take an ordinary person more than 10 years to complete in just 10 days, he would immediately become the most popular genius in the entire continent. However, even if he were to conserve his strength, he would still be able to learn 3 sword techniques in just 10 days. This had already caused a commotion among the apprentices in the School of Sword Arts. Ordinary people with mediocre talent would probably need 1 to 2 months just to grasp the basics of these 3 sword techniques. However, talent was something that others could only be envious of. Or rather, although the apprentices looked at Feng Xingjian with envy, jealousy, and admiration, most of them only trained even harder. No one wanted to be left behind. Just like what he had said, Teacher Kyle would only appear once a day in the morning and once in the afternoon to guide each apprentice. After that, he would leave in a hurry. Many apprentices would look for Ogden, Lambert, and Feng Xingjian when they realized that they did not understand or had problems with their sword techniques. Feng, Senior Feng? Feng Xingjian raised his head and saw a silver-haired young lady standing before him. She looked extremely shy, lowering her head and looking at the ground. When she finally raised her head and met Feng Xingjian's gaze, she immediately lowered her head like a startled deer. This young lady was called Vivian, and she was considered a rare beauty among the apprentices in the School of Sword Arts. As women in this continent could also become stronger through training, their social status was not much lower than that of men. Many famous experts, like what Kyle had said previously, were women. The Rose Knight who used the 4 seasons as a metaphor for nurturing, training, developing, and killing. Due to her beautiful appearance, Vivian was very popular among the apprentices in the School of Sword Arts. Many young boys even had a crush on her. Due to Feng Xingjian's sudden rise, everyone had realized that Feng Xingjian was a genius in sword arts. More apprentices had started to practice with him, and Vivian was one of them. What's the matter? However, the shyness of a beauty was unable to leave a mark on Feng Xingjian, who had lost his love. Hearing his cold words, Vivian's eyelashes trembled, as if she would cry at any moment. She said in a barely audible voice, Senior Feng, I haven't made much progress in practicing the eagle sword technique recently. Her hands were intertwined, and her voice was trembling to the extreme. It was as if Fang Xingjian was bullying her. I feel that Senior Fang is very talented, and his sword arts are very powerful. Can I trouble you to give me some pointers? If you want to learn, just watch from the side. I don't have the time to give you pointers. Ah, Vivian raised her head and saw that Fang Xingjian had already gone far away. He had found a place to practice his sword arts. Vivian bit her lip, but still followed behind him and began to practice her sword arts. Over the next few days, Vivian stayed by Fang Xingjian's side, serving him tea, water, and even food from time to time. She was extremely attentive, causing the other students to feel envious and jealous. Second Marshal Brother Lambert stood at a distance, watching this scene with narrowed eyes. The corners of his lips curled up into a disdainful smile. Genius? Not every genius can pass the prefectural selection. By the time you pass the prefectural selection, it'll be a few years later. By then, I'll have already graduated from the Royal Academy and will be participating in the regional selection. The Empire's selection is the real battlefield. After giving it some thought, he once again calmed his heart and focused on practicing his sword arts. Behind him, there was also a group of students who were practicing their sword arts with him. Beside Fang Xingjian, Ogden did not even spare a glance at Vivian. He was fully focused on practicing the grizzly bear sword technique, as if the only thing in the world was the long sword in his hand. The other students in the training grounds were only slightly distracted, and most of them had already focused on practicing their sword arts. The Empire's selection, the prefectural selection, and becoming a knight. Everyone clenched their teeth and advanced towards the goal of their dreams. Fang Xingjian repeatedly performed the 21 movements and steps of the tenor-style body strengthening sword technique, and unknowingly, he was immersed in it. He felt that the long sword in both hands matched up with the different steps and grips, forming countless combinations. Endless mysteries gushed forth, causing his movements to be constantly modified. Tenor-style body strengthening sword technique, level 13. Agility +1, reaction +2, flexibility +1. Increases the flexibility and strength of the joints and ligaments, and increases the stability of sword arts practice and attacks. By the time Fang Xingjian felt his limbs aching, the tenor-style body strengthening sword technique had already been raised to level 13. By the time he recovered from the state where he was wholeheartedly immersed in his sword arts, the sky had already turned into a dark night with a bright moon and few stars. However, at least a third of the students in the training grounds were still diligently practicing their moves. There were also 5 or 6 people walking out from the canteen, doing some warm-up exercises and preparing to continue practicing after a short break. There seemed to be an invisible sense of urgency in the air. Fang Xingjian took a deep breath and continued to immerse himself in his sword arts practice. At this moment, Fang Xingjian's 5 major attributes were Strength 18, Agility 22, Reaction 11, Endurance 8, Flexibility 12. Chapter 15. In the morning, before the sun had fully risen, the students of the School of Sword Arts had already rushed to the training grounds, yawning. There were still 4.5 months before the prefectural selection, and most of the students of the School of Sword Arts were planning to sign up. A few of the older students, like Ogden, who had participated in the prefectural selection multiple times, had been training extra hard these days. They would only go to bed after midnight. This was also because the nurturing technique did not harm the body, and the principle was to adapt to the intensity of the exercise. Therefore, they could train for a long time every day. After a while, Kyle also walked out of the house. He coughed a few times, and everyone started to train under his guidance. Just as he had said, Teacher Kyle seemed to be getting busier and busier, and the amount of time he spent giving pointers was getting shorter and shorter. However, his spirit was getting more and more energetic, like a rusty longsword that had regained its luster. About an hour later, the morning training ended, and everyone walked towards the canteen. The food for the School of Sword Arts canteen was prepared by a female chef hired by Kyle. Breakfast was 2 pieces of black bread the size of a fist, and lunch was a piece of pork the size of a baby's palm, along with a bowl of wild vegetables and a piece of bread. Breakfast and lunch cost a total of 4 copper coins. Most of the commoners only ate breakfast and lunch, skipping on dinner. Fang Xingjian also walked towards the canteen. Some of the students beside him also took out their own rations. They could not bear to eat breakfast in the School of Sword Arts. Fang Xingjian could not bear to either, but it was impossible for him to cook for himself or to eat out. The former was too time-consuming, and the latter was more expensive. After receiving 2 pieces of black bread from the female chef, Fang Xingjian chewed on it casually. This black bread was a mixture of the husk and germ of the wheat that had been crushed during the grinding process. It had a poor texture, and it tasted coarse with a hint of sourness. Although the food was coarse, it was filling and nutritious and easier to digest. It was considered the most common food for the poor. Fang Xingjian finished the black bread in his hands in 2 or 3 bites, but he still felt like he had not had enough. It was obvious that he was not full yet. For people like them who train their bodies, they naturally had high requirement for food. It could be said that if they could eat chicken, duck, fish, vegetables, and fruits every day, the effects of their training would be enhanced. But they really did not have the money. Fang Xingjian looked to his left and right. Most of the apprentices were wolfing down the bread in their hands, and then revealed a look of longing for more. An apprentice who started cultivating at the age of 7 or 8 would spend most of their time practicing martial arts. It could be said that not only would it not increase the family's income, but it would also be a huge burden. Therefore, the students here treasured their food a lot. On the other hand, not only did the descendants of nobles and knights train every day without any worries, they also received the guidance of famous teachers and were able to obtain a large amount of nutrition from food. In terms of physical attributes, they were far superior to ordinary acolytes. If only I had a little more, Fang Xingjian thought to himself. Just then, Vivian had unknowingly walked up to Fang Xingjian. She held on half a piece of black bread and said, "Senior Fang, there's too much. I won't be able to finish it. You should eat it." Gulping, Fang Xingjian eventually shook his head and said, "There's no need. It's fine." Vivian smiled, and it was as if a warm ray of sunlight had shone onto Fang Xingjian's chest. She stuffed the black bread into his hands and said, "Eat it." Fang Xingjian knew that he needed to become stronger and take revenge within 5 years. Therefore, he could not let go of any chance to grow stronger. He looked at the black bread in his hands and hesitated for a moment. At the next moment, his hunger overcame his pride, and he started wolfing down the bread. At the same time, he mumbled, "This afternoon, I'll guide you on the eagle sword technique." Vivian's eyes lit up. Thank you, thank you, senior brother." Fang Xingjian did not say much, but he thought to himself, although I've been spending the night under the bridge every day, just the food alone has almost used up all the money I have left. It's time to think of some ways to earn money. However, while he was still thinking about how to earn money, a commotion suddenly broke out in the training grounds. A golden-haired young man was standing in front of Master Kyle. The young man had sharp eyebrows and bright eyes. His brilliant golden hair shone dazzlingly under the sunlight. His handsome face, coupled with his exquisite flannel clothes, made him the Prince Charming in the eyes of all the female acolytes. And the silver-plated long sword at his waist was so stimulating that the eyes of the commoner boys turned red. However, compared to the eye-catching golden-haired young man, what attracted more attention was the muscular man standing beside him, chatting with Kyle. The man had the same black hair, black eyes, and yellow skin as Fang Xingjian. It was clear that he was a Westerner in this world, and not a native of the Empire. However, Westerners were not rare in the Empire. Compared to his appearance, what attracted more attention was the azure suit he was wearing. "Is that a knight's attire?" a student exclaimed. A knight's attire was made from the feathers of a dragon bird, the tendons of a blazing unicorn, and the scales of a caribou. Every knight's attire was meticulously made by the country's armory, and only those who passed the Empire's prefectural selection and became knights could get one. Every knight's attire had the ability to repel fire and arrows, and was as light as a feather yet impenetrable by swords and spears. It could be said to be a top-grade protective treasure, and had become the heirlooms of many families. This was the case even though anyone other than a knight would be sentenced to death if they wore it. This was because of the identity that this attire represented. Knight. Every year, they would emerge from the various regions' prefectural selections, selected from thousands of people, and become the top 10. They were the true geniuses. Looking at the knight before them, or rather, the knight's attire he was wearing, many of the apprentices present had a burning look in their eyes. Second Marshal Brother Lambert clenched his fist and thought to himself, "This time around, I must pass the prefectural selection and become a knight." Knight! Knight! Eldest Marshal Brother Ogden clenched his teeth and became even more determined. "I must become a knight. As long as I become a knight, I'll be exempted from military service and taxes, and have land. Big brother will no longer be a bachelor, and dad and mom won't sell little sister." After becoming a knight, one would be exempted from military service and taxes, and would be rewarded with land by the country. From then on, one would be able to focus on practicing martial arts, and would no longer be distracted by the chores of life. What was even more impressive was that when a knight committed a crime, they would have to be judged by the Royal Knight Association. Ordinary officials did not even have the right to judge them. Feng Xingjian looked at the knight before him, but what he was thinking was not the superiority of his status. This guy, has he completed the first transition? Unlike the warriors in Demonic City who went through their job transitions through Magic Prince, Feng Xingjian had already found out how the people in this world went through their job transitions during this period of time. At level 9, level 19, and level 29, they would reach the bottleneck. They would no longer be able to gain any experience through reading, learning, training, or killing monsters. Only by entering the secret realm would they be able to break through the bottleneck and go through the job transition. Chapter 16. Feng Xingjian had no idea what the so-called secret realm was like. The students did not know how to go through the job transition and how to choose the job transition, and Kyle had never mentioned it either. That was because in this world, almost all the job transitions were controlled by the major factions and the government. To enter the secret realm, one had to be recognized by either the faction or the government. As for the details of the job transition, the major factions kept it a secret, and ordinary people did not know about it. To enter the secret realm and undergo the real job transition, one had to completely join a sect and become an inner disciple, placing the interests of the sect above the country. The other was to be an ordinary student and participate in the Empire's selection, becoming a mid-tier existence like a knight. Of course, no matter which option it was, one had to pass many tests. Originally, Feng Xingjian had also considered joining the School of Sword Arts and becoming an inner disciple. After all, the School of Sword Arts specialized in sword arts, and its headquarters in the imperial capital was famous throughout the world. In fact, Kyle had been testing him to see if he was interested in becoming an inner disciple and heading to the headquarters to learn. However, Feng Xingjian gave up in the end because he understood something. In this world, the Empire's royalty was the biggest faction. Being able to select talents from all over the country, suppress thousands of factions, and mobilize the country's resources, the royalty was definitely the biggest and strongest faction. If Feng Xingjian wanted to become stronger within 5 years, to take revenge within 5 years, and to strengthen himself as quickly as possible, he would have to join the strongest faction and become the strongest person. Moreover, he was confident that with his talent, it was definitely possible for him to pass the prefectural selection to become a knight, then the regional selection to become a teacher training knight, and finally the national selection to become a national knight. In other words, if even someone of his talent could not do it, who else could? On the other side, the black-haired knight who was conversing with Kyle smiled casually when he saw the envious and admiring gazes of the crowd. He had seen too many such gazes, so he wasn't bothered. He nodded at Kyle and said, "In that case, teacher Kyle, it's decided." With that, he nodded at the golden-haired young man and turned to leave. Kyle clapped his hands, attracting everyone's attention. "All right, stop looking. I have a few things to say next." With that, He waved his hand at the golden-haired young man next to him, saying in a friendly manner, "This is your new classmate, Countess Treja. From now on, until the prefectural selection, he will stay here to learn the grizzly bear sword technique and the eagle sword technique with you." Countess will also be participating in the prefectural selection this time around. Everyone can help each other and learn from each other. Countess Teresa, why does this name sound so familiar? Hey, don't tell me it's that Countess Treja. Damn, could that knight be their retainer? As expected of a noble family that has been passed down for hundreds of years. Second Marshal Brother Lambert's eyes narrowed into slits as he stared at Countess Treja, wondering, that super genius from Treja and Knight Academy. Countess Treja? The entire Treja Knight Academy was owned by his family. Why would he still want to learn sword arts at the School of Sword Arts? That's not right. It's said that he had already learned more than 5 sword arts from Treja Knight Academy at the age of 12. Now that he's already 17, could it be that he has already mastered all 7 sword arts from Treja Knight Academy to the maximum level? Is that why he has come to the School of Sword Arts, which is also famous for its sword arts? How is that possible? Shocked by his own guess, Lambert clenched his fists tightly together. It's said that Countess has been focusing on sword arts in the past and has never registered for the prefectural selection. Is he going to participate this time around? No matter what, it's impossible for me to be a match for a genius like him who has been nurtured by an aristocratic family since young. Damn it, the prefectural selection hasn't even started and one of the 10 slots has already been taken. Ignoring the nervous, surprised, and envious expressions of the acolytes, the golden-haired Countess looked at the crowd with a cold and aloof expression. He chose to ignore the friendly smiles of the acolytes, or the waving and greeting of the acolytes. After all, compared to Treja Knight Academy, the School of Sword Arts was nothing more than a ditch to him. It was destined that he would not stay here for long. Even passing the prefectural selection was only a matter of course for him. His goal was to be first in the prefectural selection and next year's regional selection. He wanted to pass both the prefectural selection and the regional selection in one go and become a teacher knight. All right, everyone, continue with your training. The prefectural selection will be held in 4.5 months, so make good use of the time. Countess, come over here. I'll be teaching you the eagle sword technique and the grizzly bear sword technique. After Kyle had finished speaking, everyone continued with their training. In the next few days, as Kyle had to teach Countess, the time he left for everyone to explain became less and less, causing many of the students to lament and complain. Only Fong Xingjian continued to focus on his sword arts. His current goal was to master all 3 sword arts to the maximum level. These few nights, he had also found some manual labor to do. However, this caused his body to be overworked, and the lack of sleep also resulted in insufficient rest. In the long run, it might harm his body. He had been thinking of other ways to earn money. However, after their morning training, Kyle clapped his hands and called everyone over. All of you have been training hard recently. Ogden, how's your grizzly bear sword technique? Ogden's face lit up as he said, "Teacher, my grizzly bear sword technique has already broken through level 10. My strength and agility attributes are about to break through 20 points. There's hope for the prefectural selection this time around." Kyle nodded, his eyes filled with satisfaction. "Not bad. Previously, I was most worried about you. Now that you've mastered all 3 sword arts to level 10, I can put my mind at ease." Kyle continued, Your teacher, plan to participate in this year's Sword Hero battle in the School of Sword Arts, so I might not have the time to teach you guys. In the future, I'll only come by once a day in the morning. All of you have to work hard on your own training. In the end, you can only rely on yourselves when it comes to learning martial arts. Sword Hero Battle? Fong Xingjian frowned. The Sword Hero Battle was an internal selection system that the School of Sword Arts had imitated the Empire selection process. Clearly, Kyle's actions of leaving early and returning late, as well as the appearance of the black-haired knight, as well as Countess's training at the School of Sword Arts, were all part of his preparations for the Sword Hero Battle. Kyle continued, Ogden, your 3 sword arts have already been trained to their limits, and the training of your physical body has also reached a bottleneck. From now on, before the prefectural selection, you just have to take good care of your body and relax. Lambert, your reaction and flexibility are above Ogden's, but you must remember not to be arrogant and complacent. Your biggest problem is that you underestimate your opponents easily. Xinjiang, your training time is still too short. Don't be too nervous about the prefectural selection this time around. Just treat it as a training exercise. In the end, Kyle asked, "All right, I won't be in the dojo for a long period of time. Is there anyone who's willing to help me manage the dojo?" After Kyle said this, everyone fell silent. Clearly, in order to prepare for the prefectural selection in 4.5 months, all of them wanted to devote all their time to training. Who would be willing to help Kyle manage the dojo? Kyle sighed, not intending to force his disciple. Just as he was about to turn and leave, Fong Xingjian slowly raised his hand and asked, "Will meals be provided?" Kyle smiled and nodded. "Yes." Chapter 17. Fong Xingjian had not expected that his problem of not having enough money to eat would be solved so easily. He heaved a sigh of relief. He could now focus all his energy on sword arts training. As for helping Kyle manage the school, with his talent in sword arts, he was not afraid to waste that little bit of time. After all, the School of Sword Arts was in such dire straits that there was not much to do. Next, Fong Xingjian was called to one side of the training grounds by Kyle. Kyle looked at this disciple before him with a satisfied look on his face. To him, Fong Xingjian was not bad, be it in terms of talent or character. In comparison, although the silence of the other students was reasonable, it still made him feel a little bitterly disappointed. "Xingjian, there aren't many people in the school now, and there isn't much to do. There aren't many things for you to do. Firstly, there's the problem of the food. However, Akeley's Anne has been a cook in the School of Sword Arts for over 20 years, so she won't make many mistakes. You just need to check on the food. Secondly, there's the daily cleaning and cleaning of the grounds. There's also the tidying up and repairing of the props for practice. If anything breaks, you can go to the east of the city. I've also left the spare wooden swords. As for the cleaning of the toilets, you can let the students take turns to do it. As for the daily washing of the dishes, Akeley's aunt is getting on in years. If she's too busy, you can help her." Although Kyle said that there was not much to do, in the blink of an eye, more than an hour had passed. He smiled and said, "I've also become more and more naggy. All right, I'll still go back to the school to sleep every night. If you have any problems, you can just ask me in the morning." Fong Xingjian nodded and said, "Don't worry, teacher. I'll take care of everything." Kyle looked at Fong Xingjian. Seeing that he did not seem to have any intention of leaving, he asked, "Is there anything else?" "Teacher." Fong Xingjian hesitated for a moment before asking, "I'd like to learn another set of sword techniques from the School of Sword Arts." Kyle frowned and said, "Learn another set?" "Xingjian, it's true that you have outstanding talent, but you mustn't bite off more than you can chew. There's a limit to a person's energy. You have great talent, but to be able to master the eagle sword technique, the grizzly bear sword technique, and the tenor-style body strengthening sword technique to the maximum level within 2 to 3 years is already your limit. If you were to divert your energy into other sword techniques, it would instead slow down your progress. You must know that Ogden and the others have trained hard for almost 10 years, but they have only learned these 3 sets of sword techniques." Fong Xingjian had already expected this. He took out the excuse he had prepared and explained, "Teacher, I know. It's just that I've recently reached a bottleneck in the 3 sword techniques I've been cultivating. My proficiency is getting lower and lower, so I want to take a look at other sword techniques to comprehend by analogy and see if I can improve." "What do you mean by analogy?" Kerr laughed out loud and said, "With your current weak sword arts, if you look at other sword arts that you have never learned before, it will only affect the sword arts that you have already learned. It might just make it harder for you to improve. Do you have any thoughts when you see Kaunitz?" Kerr shook his head. "Don't compare yourself to him. He's a true super genius, and he has been nurtured by the Treja clan since he was young. The food expenses that he has eaten since he was young are probably enough for you to eat for 10 lifetimes. Moreover, He has also mastered the Treja clan's sword techniques to the maximum level, and came to learn sword arts from me in order to pursue specializations. Specializations? Fang Xingjian said in surprise. A person's battle prowess is formed by attributes, techniques, and specializations. The reason why Kaunitz is learning new sword techniques is so that he can fulfill the requirement for the specialization sword specialist and master 10 sword techniques to the maximum level. So that's how it is. A hint of understanding flashed in Fang Xingjian's eyes. At the same time, he knew that he would not be able to convince Care, so he did not insist on learning new sword techniques. Instead, he nodded, and after receiving a few more pointers from Care, he returned to the training grounds. On the other side, Kyle waved at Ogden and called him over. Ogden, you have now mastered all 3 basic sword techniques to the maximum level, and the foundation for your muscles and bones is extremely firm. I will now impart to you the School of Sword Arts 9 Yang Divine Sword, 9 Yin Divine Sword, and 9 Heavens Divine Sword. Ogden said agitatedly, 9 Yang Divine Sword, 9 Yin Divine Sword, 9 Heavens Divine Sword? That's right. The Eagle Sword Technique, Grizzly Bear Sword Technique, and the Tenor-style Body Strengthening Sword Technique are all basic techniques that train the muscles, bones, and vital energy. But the 9 Yang Divine Sword, 9 Yin Divine Sword, and 9 Heavens Divine Sword are different. They were brought over from the other side of the sea by a few unparalleled swordsmen from the Western land. Care said, these 3 sword techniques are nurturing techniques that nurture and strengthen the organs, as well as the human body's physique. Look at Kaunitz. His attributes have completely surpassed yours because he has mastered all of Treja clan's basic sword techniques. Not only are his muscles and bones as firm as a rock, his internal organs are also condensed as one. His resistance to attacks, his ability to absorb nutrients, and his explosive power have all been greatly enhanced. Moreover, he has been eating and drinking well since he was young, and has been taking all sorts of secret medicine. This is why his attributes, such as strength, agility, endurance, and flexibility, are far superior to yours. A hint of understanding flashed in Ogden's eyes. So that's how it is. But thinking of how he was going to learn this sword technique soon, he could not help but feel excited. But you must know that out of the 3 sword techniques, I can only teach you the 9 Yang Divine Sword. If you wish to learn the 9 Yin Divine Sword or 9 Heavens Divine Sword, you'll have to pass the test and join the School of Sword Arts Intersect. Most of the sects and academies in the world would only teach their disciples the ways to train their muscles and bones, which are also known as external martial arts. As for the nurturing of one's internal energy, or even the more profound and mysterious training techniques, the rules of the hare were all superficial. One had to pass the test and join the intersect before they could learn them. Only a direct descendant like Kaunitz would be able to learn Treja's sword techniques and participate in a country selection. Kyle looked at Ogden and asked, now that all 3 of your basic sword techniques have reached the maximum level, according to the rules, I will have to ask you, do you wish to join the School of Sword Arts Intersect? Ogden fell silent for a moment, then said, Teacher, can we talk about this after I participate in the prefectural selection? Kyle said, what do you think? He shook his head, a hint of disappointment flashing in his eyes. Forget it, I won't force you. Just learn the sword. Remember, although the 9 Yang Divine Sword technique trains the internal organs, how can an ordinary person directly control the internal organs? That's why the movements of the sword technique are needed to guide the blood and internal organs to train from the inside out. The 9 Yang refers to the heart, liver, spleen, lungs, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and 2 kidneys. Using the 9 Yang sword technique through the movements of the muscles and bones to pressure and guide the blood and internal organs to move, massaging the internal organs. On the other side, Fang Xingjian had already been paying attention when Ogden had been called over. When he saw Kyle starting to demonstrate a set of unfamiliar sword techniques, he became even more focused. On the surface, he seemed to be demonstrating his sword techniques, but in reality, 99% of his attention was focused on Kyle. 2 hours passed, and Kyle was no longer practicing his sword techniques. Instead, he was watching Ogden practice the 9-yang divine sword technique, occasionally pointing at Ogden's body and saying, "No, no, the stance must be empty. When you attack, you must imagine yourself curled up into a ball with all the energy gathered in your stomach." All right. That's all for now. I've taught you everything I can. The rest is up to you to comprehend. Ogden looked at Kyle, who was leaving in a hurry, and sighed. He knew that his recent 2 choices had disappointed his teacher. Moreover, his teacher was now preparing for the Sword Heroes battle, so how could he possibly focus on teaching him? However, he did not regret it. Joining the School of Sword Arts as an inner disciple would not change his fate. At most, he would be able to eat better and learn more sword techniques. It was because he understood that with his talent, it was unlikely that he would be able to make a name for himself in the School of Sword Arts. In his lifetime, he would be satisfied to be able to reach Kyle's first transition level. Therefore, only by participating in the prefectural selection, becoming a knight, and going through the first transition would he be able to change his fate, as well as the fate of his family. While Ogden was still cultivating with great difficulty, unable to comprehend the 9-yang divine sword technique, Fang Xingjian had already reached the first level of the 9-yang divine sword technique. Even though he could not hear Kyle's explanations, just by looking at his movements, he had already grasped the profoundness of it with his unparalleled talent. Holding back the joy in his heart, Fang Xingjian looked at the first level of the 9-yang divine sword technique and had no choice but to stop himself from practicing. Chapter 18. Over the next few days, Fang Xingjian practiced the School of Sword Arts' basic sword techniques in the day, and, at night, he secretly practiced the 9-yang divine sword technique. The difficulty of cultivating this divine sword technique was much higher than the grizzly bear sword technique, and Fang Xingjian's learning speed was also slower. During this period of time, Kaunitz had once again become the center of attention in the training grounds. This young genius from the Treja clan seemed to be the center of attention no matter where he went. Even when he was practicing the eagle sword technique alone, there would always be a group of boys and girls following behind him practice. It was as if they would be able to improve faster by following him. And every time Kaunitz stopped to rest or think, there would always be people offering him snacks or water to get close to him. "Young Master Kaunitz, would you like some water?" "Young Master Kaunitz, you're learning really fast. This eagle sword technique is already at level 2, right?" As expected of the genius from the Treja clan. However, in the face of such flattery, Kaunitz could not even be bothered to smile. He maintained a cold expression as he looked at the other acolytes, focusing all his attention on the sword technique. Only his slightly furrowed brows showed his impatience. All right. Don't disturb Kaunitz. The prefectural selection will depend on himself, and the same goes for martial arts training. Just then, Ogden walked up and, as usual, sent everyone away. Kaunitz nodded and said in a commanding tone, "You've come at the right time. Show me the 12th and 33rd moves of the grizzly bear sword technique." Ogden, on the other hand, started to show Kaunitz his sword technique with a cheerful expression. In fact, ever since Kaunitz had arrived, he no longer practiced with Fang Xingjian. Instead, he stayed by Kaunitz's side, practicing sword techniques with him every day, unreservedly contributing his experience in the eagle sword technique and grizzly bear sword technique. This is the successor of the Treja clan. As long as I can build a good relationship with him, the examiners in the prefectural selection will surely look up to me. Even if I don't pass the prefectural selection, I'll be able to get a job in the Treja clan. No, it'll be even better if I can enter the Treja Knight Academy. Ogden thought with the craftiness of a commoner. The wooden sword in his hand swung even harder in the next moment. Fang Xingjian did not think much of Ogden's flattery. This was reality, this was society. It was only right and proper for a subordinate to try his best to please a superior. If he did not have his extraordinary talent in swordsmanship, he might have made the same choice as Ogden. However, He had originally thought that Ogden was a simple and honest fellow. Now it seemed that Ogden only looked simple and honest on the surface. In fact, he was just a cunning commoner with his own schemes. Why is eldest senior brother like this? Vivian bit her lip and said, he used to practice swordsmanship with us. He usually looks so honest. This is too. What does this have to do with you? Fang Xingjian continued to practice the grizzly bear sword technique, planning to bring it to the maximum level. The path is chosen by oneself. Even if the academy and the prefectural selection are useful, when it comes to martial arts, one can only rely on oneself. Attributes, techniques, specialties, these are all true. Vivian turned to look at Fang Xingjian, gradually calming herself down and focusing on practicing her swordsmanship. Over the past few days, Fang Xingjian had been making the best use of his time during the day to practice the grizzly bear sword technique. His grizzly bear sword technique was now at level 29, just a little bit away from reaching level 30. The wooden sword in his hand danced rapidly, its afterimages seeming to connect together. With each slash, the sword trembled and tore through the air, producing a sound similar to a grizzly bear's roar. With a loud boom, it was as if gunpowder had been ignited in the air. To Fang Xingjian, his mind was in a state of shock, as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning in a clear sky, causing him to see stars. He was stunned, feeling his entire body go numb, as if he had been electrocuted. His muscles and bones trembled thrice before he regained his senses. Level 30 Grizzly Bear Sword Technique. Strength +6, Agility +6. Increases the toughness of bones, strengthens the strength of internal organs, and significantly increases the recovery speed of muscles and bones from fatigue, greatly increasing the potential of the body. Fang Xingjian felt as if he was soaking in a hot spring at all times. His bones, muscles were trembling slightly, continuously massaging and maintaining his body. All the excess and burdensome parts were shaken off and then cleaned up. The level 30 Grizzly Bear Sword Technique was maintaining his body at all times, helping him to increase his body's potential and strengthening his foundation. Now, his attributes had become: name, Fang Xingjian; age, 16; occupation, warrior squire; level, 9 strength, 20 agility, 24 reaction, 11 endurance, 8 flexibility. 12 his strength and agility were no longer inferior to Ogden or Lambert, who had been training at the School of Sword Art since young. In fact, they were even slightly better. Fang Xingjian's mind was in a state of joy. Just then, a commotion came from the other side of the training grounds. He's lost. Lambert has also lost. To think that eldest martial brother Ogden and second martial brother Lambert have both lost. This is Treja's super genius. Kaunitz is too amazing. How long has he been training in the Grizzly Bear Sword Technique? We'll never be able to match up to his talent in our entire lives. Kaunitz looked at Lambert, who was lying on the ground, and shook his head, saying, "Your attributes are too weak. There's no way you can unleash the profoundness of the Grizzly Bear Sword Technique. There's really no point in sparring with you." Ogden smiled at the side, as if he was not bothered by his earlier failure. He looked at the pale-faced Lambert and said, "After all, we're all people with mediocre talent. Naturally, we can't compare to a genius like young Master Kaunitz. One day of your training is equivalent to several years of our training." Lambert's chest heaved a few times, as if he wanted to say something harsh, but he did not manage to do so. In the end, his face turned red with anger, and he ran out of the door with his sword in hand. It was obvious that he did not have the face to stay here any longer. Kaunitz shook his head once again. Practicing swordsmanship requires one to be courageous and diligent, to be unyielding. If one can't even take this little bit of humiliation, what's the point of learning swordsmanship? With that, he turned his head and looked in the direction of Fang Xingjian, asking, "I heard that there's another genius in the School of Sword Arts who managed to learn the Grizzly Bear Sword Technique on the first day." Ogden nodded and said, "That's right. Teacher said that Xinjiang's foundation is extremely solid, and that before he entered the school, he had already learned a set of basic sword techniques to the maximum level. That's why he was able to pick up the grizzly bear sword technique so easily. Good foundation. Kaunitz walked up to Fang Xinjiang and said, I need someone to spar with me in the grizzly bear sword technique. I want you to try dissecting the sword moves. His tones sounded as if it was only natural and even as if he was giving alms. Not interested. Fang Xinjiang did not even turn his head and continued practicing the eagle sword technique. After reaching level 30, his grizzly bear sword technique had also reached the maximum level. His next goal was to master the eagle sword technique to the maximum level. He had no interest in sparring with Fang Xinjiang or feeding him moves. Chapter 19. Kaunitz furrowed his brows, as if he had not expected that a dirty-looking commoner would reject him. He could not be bothered to say another word. The wooden sword in his hand trembled, and with a vigorous force, it slammed forward like a bear's claw. Fang Xinjiang's brows furrowed, and with a turn of his body, he blocked the other party's blade with his sword. He felt a tremor coming from the other party's sword, and the tremendous force was like an elephant ramming into him. It almost knocked the long sword out of his hand, and he could not help but retreat 3 steps before he was able to dissipate the force. With this collision, Fang Xinjiang understood that his opponent had more or less comprehended the essence of the grizzly bear sword technique. He was indeed a rumored genius. In fact, Kaunitz's strength and agility were both over 30 points, completely above Fang Xinjiang's. If not for the fact that his grizzly bear sword technique's level was lower than Fang Xinjiang's, he would have been able to defeat Fang Xinjiang with this attack. Kaunitz did not stop after forcing his opponent back with a single strike. Instead, he took a step forward, and like a grizzly bear that had suddenly exerted its strength, the long sword in his hand pressed down with a vigorous aura. The blade of the sword tore through the air, emitting the sound of wind and thunder, and smashed down like a huge hammer. Kaunitz used the grizzly bear sword technique's method of exerting force in his 2 consecutive attacks. Unlike ordinary sword techniques, which focused on agility, it was as if a grizzly bear was recklessly displaying its brute force. After being continuously attacked by Kaunitz, Fang Xinjiang had gone through a huge change and was no longer a kind person. With a flick of the sword in his hand, tens of black shadows pierced forward. With the level 30 grizzly bear sword technique being displayed, it was as if a huge, violent bear had been awakened from hibernation, opening its huge, bloody maws and biting wildly towards Kaunitz. This was no longer a nurturing technique used to train one's body, but a killing technique born to kill. Bang, 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 bang. Their swords clashed continuously, and a series of clashing sounds rang out. It was as if a bomb had been ignited in the air. Kaunitz clearly felt that his strength and speed were above his opponent's, but every time he stabbed out with his sword, his opponent was able to instantly see through his subsequent changes. Kaunitz's attacks were all aimed at his flaws, making it difficult for him to exert his strength. The next moment, his opponent's sword shadows changed once again, and his moves became even more ferocious. More often than not, just as he was about to unleash a move, his opponent would have already countered it. This meant that his opponent's understanding of the grizzly bear sword technique's variations far surpassed his own. On the other side, Fang Xinjiang felt that everything was extremely easy. His opponent's speed was only slightly higher than his, but just by looking at the movements of his opponent's shoulders, elbows, and fingers, he could already tell which move his opponent was going to make. He was too familiar with the grizzly bear sword technique and was able to easily break his opponent's attack and even counterattack with ferocious speed. And every time their swords collided, he could feel the change in his opponent's force. This was probably the reason why Kaunitz wanted to have a duel. He wanted to learn how to exert force by feeling the other party's force. Fang Xinjiang also felt that in just a few moves, Kaunitz had already improved. He was indeed worthy of being called a genius in swordsmanship. With a crisp tearing sound, the long sword in Fang Xinjiang's hand was like a rampaging tank. After breaking through Kaunitz's sword technique, Fang Xingjian slapped away Countess's long sword with a smack, thrusting toward Countess's chest. "I've won." Just as Fang Xingjian was thinking about this, a hint of fury flashed in Countess's eyes. He flicked his fingers continuously, and it was as if every muscle in his body was emitting the sound of metal colliding. His palm, which had lost all of its strength, once again tightened its grip on the sword hilt. With an explosive clang, Fang Xingjian's attack was blocked by Countess's horizontal slash this time around. Following that, sounds of bones and tendons popping rang out from his opponent's body, and his muscles swelled up as if they had been inflated. The sword in his hand once again slashed out towards Fang Xingjian, ignoring everything else. With this slash, Countess's entire body seemed to have turned into a towering mountain, and the long sword in his hand also seemed to have the strength of a mountain. Fang Xingjian used the stance of the grizzly bear sword technique to receive the attack, but he discovered that his opponent's strength was vigorous and condensed, as if a mountain was pressing down on him. With a stifled grunt, he quickly retreated. It was obvious that Countess was unwilling to be defeated, and had directly switched to the sword technique he was most proficient in. The sword technique he was performing now was Treason Knight Academy's nurturing technique, Chaotic Strike. This set of sword technique emphasized on training the strength and explosive power of one's muscles and bones. Countess had long since trained the Chaotic Strike to the maximum level of level 12. Now that he was performing it, it was like a titan lifting up a mountain and smashing it down continuously. Countess had always been proud of being able to train this set of sword technique to the level of excellence at level 12. On the other side, Fang Xingjian could not see any openings and was completely suppressed by his opponent's superior speed and strength. Bang, 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 bang. After receiving 5 to 6 attacks consecutively, Fang Xingjian felt his vital energy and blood churning and his arms turning numb. It was as if his long sword would fall out of his hands at any moment. This time around, Countess's attributes were completely unleashed, and he was no longer suppressed like when he had been using the grizzly bear sword technique. In an instant, Fang Xingjian felt an immense pressure. This guy, his strength, agility, and flexibility are all at least 30 and above. Fang Xingjian felt as if he had been blasted by a cannon with every sword attack he received. Relying on the unfamiliar sword technique and the complete suppression of his attributes, Fang Xingjian was completely suppressed by Countess in an instant. This was what it meant to suppress someone with strength. Another 3 consecutive heavy blows, each sword heavier than the one before, not giving Fang Xingjian any chance to retaliate. Finally, with a loud crack, the last blow broke the wooden sword in Fang Xingjian's hand into 2, dropping it onto the ground. Ogden immediately walked up and said, "What a powerful sword technique." Young Master Countess, was that the sword technique that was passed down in Treja's lineage? It feels much more powerful than our grizzly bear sword technique. This sword technique's aura is powerful and heavy. It feels like the explosive power is even above that of the grizzly bear sword technique. The surrounding apprentices all came up to fawn over him, but Countess's face was filled with displeasure. He had lost in the duel of the grizzly bear sword technique and was forced to use the sword technique he had originally learned. To a genius like him, this was equivalent to losing. With a cold snort, he turned to leave, intending to train for a few more days and level up the grizzly bear sword technique before coming back to spar with Fang Xingjian. Vivian ran to Fang Xingjian's side and asked anxiously, "Senior Xingjian, are you all right?" Fang Xingjian rubbed his slightly numb wrist and did not reply. His attention had already been attracted by the skill's window. He did not know when another skill had appeared on it. Chaotic Strike, 5%. Chaotic Strike? Could this be the sword technique that Countess had just used? A look of astonishment flashed in Fang Xingjian's eyes. To think that my talent has reached such a level that I can learn my opponent's sword technique just by sparring with him? Fang Xingjian, who had been a little depressed at not being able to learn the other sword techniques from a school of sword arts, was now completely excited. He did not even care about the fact that he had been defeated by Countess. He casually took Vivian's long sword and called out to Kaunitz, who had turned to leave. "Hey, let's have another round." Kaunitz turned his head and looked at Feng Xingjian expressionlessly. In fact, he could also feel that Feng Xingjian's grizzly bear sword technique was much more exquisite than Ogden's. If he could spar with Feng Xingjian, his grizzly bear sword technique would improve even faster. He had been born with an innate specialty called force sensing. Such a situation where one was born with an innate specialty was called an innate specialty, and it was also a sign of a genius. Kaunitz's force sensing could sense the changes in his opponent's force more clearly than ordinary people. Therefore, when he practiced his sword techniques, he liked to spar with experts in the same field. This way, he could increase his proficiency very quickly. However, he would not be able to defeat Feng Xingjian with just the grizzly bear sword technique, and he hated people who refused to admit defeat when they failed. This was why he had thought of challenging Feng Xingjian in a few days' time. Seeing that Feng Xingjian still dared to challenge him, Feng Xingjian's lips curled into a cold smile, saying, "Since you're looking for a beating, I'll naturally accompany you to the end." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.